They wore the title of Mr. President, but behind the speeches and seal were men drowning in loss, children buried, wives lost, bullets fired, minds unraveling. This isn't the story you read in textbooks. This is the cost of power when fate doesn't care who you are. From White House weddings turned funerals to invisible wars waged inside the mind, these are the most tragic stories of U.S. presidents. And once you hear them, you'll never look at the Oval Office the same way again. Abraham Lincoln. Death was a frequent guest in Abraham Lincoln's house. It knocked quietly at first, almost politely, as if testing the door. Eddie, the second child, was the first to answer. He was only 3 years old when tuberculosis, or what they called consumption, tightened its grip on his small lungs and took him in 1850. Mary Todd Lincoln, already prone to melancholia, fell into a grief so deep it seemed to hollow her out. Abraham, somber but steady, kept walking forward. But the echo of Eddie's absence would never stop following him. It would grow louder. Then came the White House. The nation was ripping itself apart, state by state, scream by scream, and Abraham Lincoln, the tall, thin, stovepipe-hatted man with deep-set eyes and a voice like a morning bell, was the only one trying to stitch it back together. But even in the heart of national catastrophe, death was not done with the Lincolns. In 1862, their 11-year-old son Willie fell ill. It began as a fever. At first, they thought it might pass, but this was the 19th century. Medicine was more superstition than science, and White House sanitation was a contradiction in terms. The boy died of what was likely typhoid fever, another victim of the dirty water flowing through the Capitol. Willie had been the golden child. Sweet, poetic, pious. Lincoln called him the one most like me. When he died, the president's grief was unlike anything he'd experienced before. He wandered the White House halls at night, eyes vacant, whispering to shadows. Mary Todd collapsed under the weight of it, retreating into mourning clothes and seances, believing she could speak to him through spiritualists. Lincoln, though skeptical, allowed it. He understood the madness of grief too well to deny someone else their method of survival. And still, he had a war to fight. The Civil War devoured over 600 American lives. Each battle was another tear in the national fabric, and Lincoln wore those casualties like stones sewn into his coat. Every letter from a grieving mother, every report from the front, carved into him. His shoulders slumped lower. His face grew lines like canyon walls. Photographs of Lincoln from his first term to his last show, a man who aged decades in just 4 years. And then came April 14, 1865, just 5 days after General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox. Abraham Lincoln went to Ford's Theater to see a British comedy, Our American Cousin. He needed a laugh. The country did too. John Wilkes Booth thought otherwise. At 10:15 p.m., Booth stepped into the presidential box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head. The president slumped forward, never regaining consciousness. He died the next morning, April 15, as the sun rose over a fractured republic. Mary Todd, who had already buried 3 of her 4 sons, Eddie, Willie, and eventually Tad, now had to bury her husband too. And the remaining son, Robert? He would live to see his mother institutionalized. Because grief, as it turns out, wasn't finished with the Lincolns either. Robert Todd Lincoln, who had been at the bedside of his father when he died, also bore witness to his mother's unraveling. By the 1870s, Mary's mental health had deteriorated so severely that Robert arranged to have her committed to an insane asylum. She was released a year later, but the betrayal lingered. She died in 1882, isolated and embittered. Abraham Lincoln is remembered as the great emancipator, the orator of Gettysburg, the martyr president. But beneath the monuments and the marble, there was a man hollowed by sorrow, a father who lost more than most men ever do. And it wasn't just his story. Because sitting in the theater with Lincoln that night was another woman who knew grief intimately. She wasn't just mourning her husband's death, she was mourning the life she never truly got to live. She was mourning the days before politics, before war, before ghosts came to live in every room of her house. Her name was Mary Todd Lincoln, and her tragedy was only just beginning. Mary Todd Lincoln. Before the White House, before the war, before the seances and shadowed parlors, Mary Todd was the belle of Lexington, Kentucky. Born into a wealthy slaveholding family in 1818, she was sharp, well-educated, and just unruly enough to be interesting. A young woman who read Shakespeare, debated politics, and believed her place wasn't in the background. She spoke French, played the piano, and kept a diary filled with aspirations larger than the drawing rooms she was expected to inhabit. Then she met Abraham Lincoln. He was awkward, unrefined, a lawyer from the frontier with ambition burning behind quiet eyes. Most of her family disapproved. She married him anyway. It wasn't a fairy tale. Mary Todd Lincoln's life is often reduced to hysteria and tragedy, but that's not how it began. She was vivacious, politically engaged, and deeply involved in her husband's career, far more so than most wives of her time. But life didn't wait long to begin its dissection of her. The deaths came first. Always the deaths. In 1850, her second son, Edward, Eddie, died at age 3. He had always been sickly thin and pale, with wide, curious eyes. Tuberculosis stole him quietly. Mary collapsed into mourning, and society, with its soft silks and strict rules, offered little comfort. But she endured. The White House changed everything. When Abraham Lincoln took office in 1861, Mary arrived in Washington eager to impress. She oversaw renovations, hosted glittering parties, and tried to present herself as the fashionable First Lady. But the nation was coming undone, and her spending became a national scandal. Newspapers called her frivolous, corrupt. Even a Confederate spy or half-brothers were fighting for the South. Mary had no country, and she had no peace. Then Willie died. It was 1862, and the Civil War was painting the Potomac red. Willie Lincoln, age 11, developed a fever that wouldn't break. Doctors whispered of typhoid. He wasted away slowly, day by day, as Mary kept vigil beside his bed. When he died, she shattered. She didn't attend the funeral. She couldn't. Instead, she locked herself in her room for weeks, draped mirrors, closed curtains. She dressed in black and rarely changed. Her grief was volcanic, obliterating everything that wasn't her son. Abraham returned to his duties, his face now carved from stone. Mary lingered in the aftershock. She turned to spiritualism. Seances became a frequent occurrence in the White House. In the red parlor, lit by gaslight and trembling hands, mediums claimed to speak with the dead. Mary believed she could hear her son's voice. She clung to these voices like lifelines, because the living world had become unbearable. And it got worse. 3 years later, the war ended. 5 days after that, her husband was shot in the head in front of her. She sat beside him in the theater box, laughing one moment, then drowning in blood the next. When the bullet hit, Mary screamed not a ladylike gasp, but a raw animal cry that echoed across generations. At the Peterson house, as Abraham lay dying across the street from the theater, Mary was kept out of the room. She was inconsolable, and the doctors didn't want her hysteria interrupting the dignity of the president's final hours. She collapsed again, this time into a silence thicker than any previous grief. She became a widow at 46. Tad, her youngest and only surviving child at the time, tried to comfort her, but even Tad couldn't save her from the collapse. The years that followed were a slow, public unraveling. She traveled across Europe, sometimes staying in hotels under fake names, convinced enemies were plotting to kill her. She believed she was being poisoned. She claimed strangers were trying to rob her. Her letters grew erratic. She lived in a world full of ghosts. In 1871, Tad died at 18. Tuberculosis again. The last thread snapped. Mary now had outlived 3 of her 4 sons and her husband. The once glamorous First Lady, who had danced in Parisian silks and debated senators, was now a woman adrift. No home, no anchors. Robert, her only surviving son, had built a successful life. He was a respected lawyer and had served as Secretary of War. But he saw his mother becoming a danger to herself and to his reputation. He petitioned the court to have her declared insane. The trial was swift, brutal, public. In 1875, Mary Todd Lincoln was committed to a private asylum in Batavia, Illinois. The newspapers had a field day. "Mrs. Lincoln mad," the headlines blared. She was not informed of the trial until after it had concluded. She was not allowed to defend herself. The diagnosis? Mental derangement. She tried to overdose on laudanum soon after her commitment. She survived. Eventually, friends and sympathetic doctors helped secure her release. She never forgave Robert. She never recovered. In her final years, Mary lived in a boarding house in Springfield, Illinois, draped in heavy mourning clothes even on the hottest days. Her mind wandered through memory and hallucination. She spoke to her sons as if they were in the room. She clutched photographs as if they were lifelines. Her handwriting became jagged and illegible. Her body followed her mind, collapsing under years of grief and untreated illness. She died in 1882, at the age of 63, from a stroke. The nation did not mourn her like it mourned her husband. She was remembered, when remembered at all, as eccentric, difficult, insane. The woman who spent too much money. The woman who cried too loudly. The woman who talked to ghosts. But Mary Todd Lincoln was more than that. She was a mother who buried 4 children. A wife who held her husband's hand as he died of a bullet wound meant for a symbol. A widow exiled by politics and grief, hunted by a media that had no sympathy for madness. And yet, even as her life disintegrated, she never stopped trying to speak with the dead. Because in her world, the dead were the only ones who stayed. But while Mary Todd Lincoln spiraled downward into a haunted solitude, another president faced death not with spiritualism, but with the cold, antiseptic horror of 19th century medicine. His name was James A. Garfield. And he didn't die quickly. James A. Garfield. The bullet didn't kill him. Not at first. James Abram Garfield, the 20th President of the United States, was standing in the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad station on the morning of July 2, 1881. It was humid, already 80 degrees before noon. He was heading north, to Massachusetts, to give a speech. He was in good spirits. Accompanied by his 2 sons, his Secretary of State, and a small handful of aides, Garfield moved casually, unguarded. Presidents didn't yet travel with security details. The office, though powerful, had not yet become a target. Until that morning, a man named Charles Guiteau, delusional, embittered, and convinced he was owed a government job, stepped out of the crowd with a pistol. He shouted something. He raised his hand. He fired twice. The first bullet grazed the president's arm. The second tore through his lower back, just above the hip. It burrowed deep into his body and lodged somewhere near the spine. Garfield collapsed instantly, the bright tile floor echoing with his fall. He wasn't dead, not yet, but he was broken. He had only been in office 4 months. The station was chaos, Blood pooled around him. Doctors arrived, frantic, poorly equipped, and were certain they were right. They began probing the wound immediately, using their unwashed fingers and unsterilized instruments, hunting for the bullet as if poking through a haystack. What followed was not a quick death. It was a slow-motion disaster, a drawn-out national tragedy that unfolded over 79 agonizing days. Doctors debated. They disagreed. They guessed. They dug. Again and again, they inserted fingers into Garfield's back, trying to locate the bullet. In doing so, they introduced infection bacteria crawling into his bloodstream, hitchhiking on the hands of his well-meaning murderers. Germ theory was just beginning to gain ground in Europe, but American medicine was still suspicious of it. Antiseptics were rarely used. Cleanliness was optional. Sterility was science fiction. Garfield's condition fluctuated. He was moved from the station to the White House, where a makeshift hospital room was created. Ice was packed around the windows to battle the July heat. Flies buzzed in the corners. A fan turned slowly, and Garfield, stoic, fading, waited. For a while, it looked like he might survive. He rallied briefly in August. He dictated letters. He saw his children. But beneath the surface, his body was waging a losing war. Pus began to leak from the wound. He grew skeletal, dropping nearly 80 pounds. He couldn't eat solid food. His heart rate climbed. His temperature rose. Tunnels of infection spread through his back and legs. His wife, Lucretia, who had already endured one near-death experience after contracting malaria earlier that year, stayed by his side. By September, the president could barely move. The nation watched in horror. Newspapers ran daily updates, complete with temperature charts and heart rate graphs. It was the first time the American people witnessed a president's suffering in real time. Telegraph lines burned with reports from the White House. Hope rose and fell with every bulletin. Still, the doctors kept digging. A prominent physician, Dr. D. Willard Bliss, a man with a name seemingly destined for irony, was in charge of Garfield's care. He had once been expelled from the American Medical Association for promoting quack remedies. Now, he was the gatekeeper of the president's life. He refused to allow other doctors to examine the wound. He rejected antiseptic methods. He insisted the bullet was lodged on the right side of Garfield's body, despite signs suggesting otherwise. Bliss's pride may have sealed Garfield's fate. In desperation, Alexander Graham Bell was brought in to use a metal detector he had invented to locate the bullet. It was state-of-the-art, a marvel of science. But the device kept giving false readings. Why? Because the president was lying on a bed with metal springs and because Bliss only allowed Bell to scan the right side of Garfield's body. The bullet was on the left. Meanwhile, Charles Guiteau sat in jail, proud of what he had done. He believed God had told him to kill the president. He called himself a stalwart of the stalwarts and insisted Garfield's death was politically necessary. His behavior was erratic, boastful, detached from reality. He predicted he would be celebrated. He wasn't. On September 19, 1881, James A. Garfield died. The official cause, blood poisoning and ruptured arteries caused by the relentless probing of his wound. The bullet itself, still lodged in his body, had not passed through any vital organs. He didn't die from the gunshot. He died from the doctors. The autopsy confirmed what everyone had suspected. The bullet could have been safely left in place. Had the wound been kept clean, had antiseptic techniques been used, had arrogance been set aside, he might have lived. But he didn't. His body was returned to Ohio in a funeral train that traveled across the country. Mourners lined the tracks. Flags flew at half-mast. The nation, already weary from war and division, now had to bury another president, another life cut short, another leader stolen not just by violence, but by ignorance wrapped in authority. Lucretia Garfield lived another 36 years. She never remarried. She built a library in his honor and preserved his papers, dedicating her life to the memory of the man who had died so slowly. One of their sons, James Rudolph Garfield, later served as Secretary of the Interior, but the father he admired had been dead for decades. Guiteau was tried and found guilty. His defense team pleaded insanity, but the jury didn't buy it. On June 30, 1882, he was hanged. His final words, "Glory, glory, glory." James A. Garfield had served as president for 199 days. Only 120 of those were conscious. Only 80 were functional. And nearly all of them were spent under siege, not by foreign enemies or political rivals, but by a man with a gun and a medical system that didn't know when to stop. His story is often forgotten, sandwiched between Lincoln's martyrdom and McKinley's assassination, overshadowed by presidents with longer legacies or flashier failures. But Garfield's suffering mattered. His life and his death cast a long shadow on American medicine and the office of the presidency. He wasn't the first president to die in office, and he wouldn't be the last. Because just 40 years earlier, another man had taken the oath of office, braved the cold winds of March without a coat, and delivered a 2-hour speech to prove his vigor. He was dead within a month. His name was William Henry Harrison, and his tragedy was built on brevity. William Henry Harrison. It began with a speech. March 4, 1841, Washington, D.C. The wind was merciless, the sky gray and threatening. But the new president, William Henry Harrison, hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe, symbol of log cabins and hard cider, refused to let the weather dictate the terms of his inauguration. He was 68 years old, the oldest man ever elected president at the time, and this was his moment. He mounted the platform without a coat. No hat, no gloves, just a suit, a smile, and a manuscript of epic proportions. As the cold air whipped across the Capitol grounds, Harrison began to read. And read. And read. The speech stretched past 90 minutes, the longest inaugural address in American history. Over 400 words, a deluge of classical references, policy ideals, and philosophical musings. The crowd thinned. The temperature dropped. Harrison stood, resolute and exposed, until he had said every last word. He shook hands. He rode in a parade. He attended multiple inaugural balls, and he did it all without protection from the biting elements. The office of the presidency had finally come to him after decades of military service, failed campaigns, and bitter political battles. He wasn't about to act like a frail old man now, but his body had other plans. Within weeks, William Henry Harrison was dead. It didn't happen immediately. He seemed fine at first. He went about the early business of his administration. He argued with his cabinet. He tried to assert authority in a party that had never truly been his to command. He talked too much, slept too little, and burned through his fragile health like a candle left too close to the fire. Then, in late March, he developed a cold. The doctors called it catarrh. Nothing serious, they said, but the symptoms worsened. His chest tightened. His breathing grew shallow. By the 1st of April, he was coughing uncontrollably. The fever climbed. The diagnosis shifted to pneumonia. 19th century medicine met the challenge with its usual weapons: mustard plasters, laudanum, castor oil, leeches. They bled him. They purged him. They blistered his skin. They tried to sweat the illness out. None of it worked. William Henry Harrison died on April 4, 1841, 31 days into his presidency. He never got the chance to govern. He never signed a single major law. He never set foot outside Washington in his official capacity. He never even unpacked. It was the shortest presidency in U.S. history. and it left the nation reeling. There were no precedents for this. No one had ever died in office before. The Constitution was unclear, fatally vague about what was supposed to happen next. Did the vice president become president? Or just acting president? John Tyler, Harrison's vice president, decided the matter himself. He declared he was now fully president and took the oath of office. Some called it a power grab. Others called it necessary. But none of that mattered to Harrison's family, now steeped in sudden mourning. His wife, Anna, had not even arrived in Washington yet. She had stayed behind in Ohio due to illness. She was preparing for the journey when news of his death reached her. Instead of joining him in the White House, she joined the country in burying him. She never stepped foot in the executive mansion. Harrison's funeral was solemn, befitting a fallen leader, but it was also rushed. Spring was approaching. The body couldn't wait. He was laid to rest in a temporary tomb in the Congressional Cemetery in Washington, then later reinterred in Ohio. The legacy of William Henry Harrison, such as it was, consisted mostly of unfulfilled promises and unanswered questions. But his death was more than a bureaucratic hiccup. It became legend, because Harrison's brief and tragic presidency wasn't seen as just bad luck. It was seen as something darker. A curse. The so-called Curse of Tippecanoe, also known as Tecumseh's Curse, would come to haunt American folklore for generations. The legend claimed that Native American leader Tecumseh, his brother, the prophet Tenskwatawa, placed a curse on Harrison after he led American forces against indigenous confederations at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811. According to the myth, every president elected in a year divisible by 20 would die in office, and for a while, the pattern held. Harrison, 1840, died of pneumonia. Lincoln, 1860, assassinated. Garfield, 1880, assassinated. McKinley, 1900, assassinated. Harding, 1920, heart attack. Roosevelt, 1940, cerebral hemorrhage. Kennedy, 1960, assassinated. The idea that a curse had been laid on Harrison and that it had rippled through the Oval Office for over a century took root in the American imagination. It became a footnote in history books, a staple of trivia nights, a whisper of the supernatural. But for the Harrison family, the reality was more mundane and far more cruel. William Henry Harrison had waited his entire life for the presidency. He had fought in the War of 1812, governed the Indiana Territory, served as minister to Columbia, and battled political obscurity for decades. He had been nominated as a compromise candidate, marketed as a log cabin dwelling, cider-drinking war heroine image, far from the educated aristocrat he truly was. And then, when he finally reached the pinnacle of power, the job took everything from him in just 4 weeks. There were no great speeches from the resolute desk, no treaties signed, no scandals, no triumphs, no defining crises, just 31 days. A cold day, a long speech, a cough that never stopped, and then silence. For decades after his death, Harrison was a historical footnote, the man with the shortest presidency, the man who wouldn't wear a coat, a punchline in textbooks. But in that brief window of time, the office changed. Because Harrison's death forced the country to confront a question it had never faced. What happens when the president dies? The answer, at first, was chaos. It would take a century and a constitutional amendment to fully settle the issue, but the crisis began with Harrison. The man who didn't even live long enough to make a single appointment still managed to alter the trajectory of executive power. Yet, his story isn't one of influence. It's one of fragility. A man stands before the people. He speaks of destiny, of unity, of courage, He braves the wind and the chill and the burden of expectation, and within a month, he is gone. No war, no assassination, no enemy's hand. Just a virus, a storm, a decision not to wear a coat. The president cites power, its myth, its illusion of invincibility was pierced by a gust of wind and a strain of pneumonia. And just a decade later, it would happen again. Another man, another sudden death. But this time, the cause would be murkier. The setting? A 4th of July celebration. The symptoms? Bizarre, sudden, deadly. And the theories? Poison, ice, milk, cherries. His name was Zachary Taylor, and no one really knows how he died. Zachary Taylor, July 4, 1850, Washington, D.C. The heat was oppressive, the air stagnant like breath, held too long. President Zachary Taylor, a war hero turned commander-in-chief, stood beneath the searing sun attending 4th of July festivities at the newly built Washington Monument. He was 65 years old, stocky, barrel-chested. A soldier to his core. He had survived wars, sieges, and the choking humidity of battlefields. A little summer heat wasn't going to stop him. He watched the fireworks, listened to the speeches, and mingled with the crowd. But by the end of the day, his body was beginning to revolt. He returned to the White House overheated and dehydrated. To cool down, he did what many did in 19th century America. He consumed large amounts of raw fruit, specifically cherry sand, washed them down with iced milk. It was a popular combination in the era. Sweet, tart, refreshing, innocent. Until it wasn't. That night, Taylor began experiencing stomach cramps. Diarrhea, vomiting, fever. The symptoms escalated rapidly. Within a day, he was bedridden. By the next, he was delirious. The President of the United States, in the prime of his power, was dying. The official diagnosis? Cholera morbusson, antiquated term for acute gastroenteritis, likely caused by foodborne bacteria. But that's only part of the story. Because Zachary Taylor didn't just die, he dissolved. The next 5 days were a slow, grotesque spiral. Doctors treated him with the usual toolkit of 1850s medicine: opium, calomel, a mercury-based purgative, quinine, and emetics. They bled him. They applied mustard poultices. They tried to balance his humors. In short, they did everything wrong. And the president got worse. His skin turned sallow, his eyes yellowed, his body shriveled from within. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes aware, sometimes mumbling incoherently. The doctors were helpless. They had seen stomach infections before, but this one wouldn't break. Taylor's robust military frame, once the scourge of Mexican armies, was collapsing in real time. On July 9, 1850, 5 days after the 4th of July, Zachary Taylor died. The official cause was listed as cholera morbus, but even then, doubts began to surface. The suddenness of the illness, the peculiar combination of symptoms, the odd timing. Political enemies whispered. Conspiracy theories ignited. Poison. Had Taylor been poisoned? It seemed plausible. He had enemies, powerful ones. His stance against the expansion of slavery into new territories had alienated many Southern politicians. His moderate approach to the national crisis brewing between North and South made him a target for extremists on both sides. And unlike Harrison before him, Taylor had started to act. He had vetoed legislation, threatened to hang secessionists, taken a firm, almost defiant stand. His death, convenient to some, became suspicious to others. No autopsy was performed. His body was buried quickly at what is now the Zachary Taylor National Cemetery in Louisville, Kentucky. But the question lingered like a bad taste. Was this nature, or was this murder? In 1991 over 140 years later, historian named Clara Rising convinced Taylor's descendants to allow an exhumation. His remains were tested by a team of forensic scientists at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. They looked for traces of arsenic, the poison of choice in the 19th century. The results were inconclusive. Yes, there were trace amounts of arsenic in his system, but not enough to suggest foul play, not enough to kill a man, at least not by today's standards. But foodborne pathogens? Absolutely possible. The water supply in Washington at the time was notoriously contaminated. Raw milk often carried disease, and refrigeration? Primitive, at best. The cherries he consumed may have been tainted. The milk may have been spoiled, or both. And once the bacteria took hold, the so-called treatment did the rest. Taylor's death came just 16 months into his presidency. Like Harrison before him, he had barely gotten started. His wife, Margaret Peggy Taylor, was too stricken to attend his funeral. She had never wanted her husband to run for office. She hated Washington, hated politics. She called the presidency a plot to murder him. And in the end, she wasn't far off. She died 2 years later, in 1852, heart failure. But her spirit had broken long before that. Their surviving children carried on their father's military legacy. Their son Richard became a Confederate general. But the loss of their father cast a long shadow. He was the second president to die in office. And once again, the vice presidency position, barely understood at the time, was thrust into center stage. Millard Fillmore, a man little known and less loved, assumed the presidency. The nation barely had time to mourn. Because Taylor's death wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a national disruption. The compromise of 1,850 an uneasy legislative package designed to balance free and slave states had been stuck in political limbo. Taylor had opposed it. Fillmore supported it. His sudden rise to power changed the course of the entire debate. But in this story, we don't care about legislation. We care about the body on the table, the man in the bed. The soldier who fought in 2 wars, rode horses across hostile frontiers, survived ambushes and sieges only to be undone by a bowl of cherries and a glass of milk. The tragedy isn't just that Taylor died. It's that he died like anyone could. Vulnerable, alone, stripped of strength, title, and command. Just another man in a dark room, begging the pain to stop. And unlike presidents who died by violence, by bullets, blades, or bombs, Taylor's death was more insidious. He died surrounded by care, and it wasn't enough. He died in the most powerful house in the country, and it didn't matter. He died on a warm summer night, and the world moved on. History tried to forget him, tried to pack him away with the other brief accidental presidencies, but the truth lingers like spoiled milk in the back of a fridge. The presidency doesn't protect anyone. Not from bacteria, not from malpractice, not from fate. And so, from one man laid low by fruit, we turn to another, brought down by steel and silence. His legs didn't work. His smile did. He projected strength even as his body betrayed him. And when he died, it wasn't just the end of an era. It was the end of a war. His name was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he carried a nation on his back until it broke him. Franklin D. Roosevelt. He could not walk. Not truly. Not without pain. Not without help. For most of his presidency, Franklin Delano Roosevelt moved through history with steel braces hidden beneath finely tailored trousers, with aides standing just out of frame, ready to catch him. The illusion of mobility was choreographed. maintained with rehearsed precision. Cameras were instructed not to film him being lifted, carried, or assisted. He gripped podiums with white knuckles when he gave speeches, holding himself upright with strength borrowed from sheer willpower, because the image had to endure. But behind that image, behind the cigarette holder, the jovial grin, the charismatic confidence, there was a man whose body had failed him decades before the world noticed. It began in 1921. He was 39 years old, fit, athletic, a rising star in American politics. He loved to sail, to swim, to hike the forests around his family's estate in Hyde Park. Then, after a summer trip to Campobello Island in New Brunswick, Canada, something went wrong. One morning, he woke up with a chill in his spine. By nightfall, his legs had stopped working. The diagnosis was infantile paralysis polio, a disease most often associated with children. Polio had no regard for its victim's age, class, or status. It entered the body quietly and sometimes exited with lifelong consequences. For Roosevelt, it left him paralyzed from the waist down. He tried everything: mineral baths, electrotherapy, massage, braces. Nothing restored the nerves. The damage was done. He would never walk unaided again. But this is not a story about surrender. Franklin Roosevelt refused to be defined by what he had lost. He dedicated himself to recovery, not necessarily of function, but of control. He spent years at Warm Springs, Georgia, building a therapeutic center for polio patients, turning personal catastrophe into a mission. He masked his vulnerability with charm, masked his pain with jokes. The illness never left him. It simply became background noise. Then came the presidency. In 1933, Roosevelt took office in the pit of the Great Depression. He brought with him a defiant optimism, a voice that sounded like hope wrapped in velvet. His body may have been broken, but his mind was quicksilver. He worked long hours, held court with advisors, battled banks, factories, foreign despots, and domestic despair, all while his legs remained lifeless. He learned to hide it. Reporters who dared publish unflattering photos found themselves blacklisted. Staff constructed elaborate ramps and pulleys. The White House was retrofitted to accommodate a president who could not climb stairs. To the public, he was robust. To history, he became the face of resilience. But inside the man, war raged. Chronic pain, constant infections, urinary issues, digestive problems. Every movement was a calculation, every public appearance a risk. His body was under siege not from bullets or bombs, but from itself. And the war would only get harder. When World War II broke out in Europe, Roosevelt was already serving his second term. By the time the U.S. entered the war in 1941, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, he was into his third. No president had ever done what he was doing. No one had led this long, this deep into both domestic and international crisis. He did it from a wheelchair. Privately, his health was crumbling. By 1943, Roosevelt was suffering from high blood pressure, often exceeding 200 systolic. He had arteriosclerosis, angina, a damaged heart. His physicians, especially Admiral Ross McIntyre, kept these conditions under tight wraps. The president's health was classified as a state secret. And yet he traveled, flew across oceans, met with Churchill and Stalin at Yalta, delivered speeches that roused millions, smiled into cameras. Behind closed doors, though, he was fading. In public, Roosevelt sat upright. In private, he was carried. He was re-elected to a fourth term in 1944. By then, his face was pale, hollow. He had lost significant weight. His energy waned. The war was nearing its climax, and the president was barely holding on. In April 1945, he retreated to the little White House in Warm Springs. It was supposed to be a short rest, a moment of calm before the final push toward victory in Europe. He posed for a portrait on April 12. He looked gaunt, unwell. Then, as he was sitting for lunch, he said, "I have a terrific headache." He collapsed. A cerebral hemorrhage. Massive. Instant. He was dead before the doctors could do anything. Just like that, after 12 years, 1 month, and 8 days in office, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was gone. The commander-in-chief who had steered America through the Great Depression, who had orchestrated the greatest military mobilization in history, who had spoken to the people over the radio with fireside warmth, was gone. Vice President Harry Truman, barely briefed on the secrets of the war, was summoned in the middle of the day. He was handed the presidency, the atomic bomb project, and the full weight of a world on fire. Back in Warm Springs, the president's body was prepared for transport. His portrait unfinished sat on the easel beside his chair, the smile half-painted, the eyes incomplete. He was 63 years old. Back in Washington, Eleanor Roosevelt was told the news by phone. Her reaction was characteristically calm, but inside, another war had ended. She had long lived a parallel life from her husband, a partner in politics, but distant in private. Yet his death shook her. America's mourning was swift and all-consuming. Roosevelt's funeral train moved slowly from Georgia to D.C. Crowds gathered at every station, thousands upon thousands of people, black, white, poor, rich, silent, hatless, grieving. No music played, just the low groan of steel wheels and the rustle of flags at half-mast. The funeral was modest by presidential standards. No grand parades, no extended eulogies, just a nation standing still, just the end of something colossal. But here is the truth behind the curtain. Roosevelt had not been healthy for a long time. His final years were a triumph of mind over body, of appearance over reality. He had concealed, persevered, and endured until his body gave out entirely. There were no bullets, no milk, no cherries. Just a man who carried the world on his shoulders for too long. The tragedy of Franklin Roosevelt isn't just that he died in office, it's that he had no other option. He could never stop. The presidency was not just his job, it was the scaffold holding him upright. Without it, the pain would have devoured him. He died as he lived in service, in motion, in control, until he wasn't. And yet, even as the nation mourned, death was already packing its bags for Dallas. Because the next time a president died in office, it would not be in bed. It would be in a convertible, in broad daylight, with cameras rolling. John F. Kennedy. It was a day made for cameras. Clear skies, sharp sunlight, the kind of Texas morning that looked crisp even in grainy black and white. November 22, 1963, Dallas. The motorcade moved through the city like a parade, float on rail, slow, deliberate, smiling faces peeking out from behind convertible windshields. At the front, a Lincoln Continental with its top down. In the back seat, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States. Beside him, Jacqueline Kennedy, in pink, poised, perfect, a visual poem of mid-century elegance. They waved. The crowd waved back. It was the choreography of democracy's miles, flags, sunshine, and optimism. And then, at 12:30 p.m., Dealey Plaza, it all unraveled. 3 shots, or maybe 2, or maybe more. The Zapruder film would be rewound, paused, dissected frame by frame for decades, but no amount of clarity would make it any less grotesque. The bullet entered the back of Kennedy's neck, exited through his throat. Another entered his skull and exploded out the front, shattering bone, spraying blood and brain across the trunk of the limousine. Jacqueline climbed out onto the back of the car, not to escape, but to retrieve fragments of her husband's head. The limousine accelerated. In the back seat, the president's body slumped toward her. His face was no longer a face. He was pronounced dead at 1:00 p.m. at Parkland Memorial Hospital. A priest administered last rites. Doctors tried, pointlessly, to resuscitate what remained. The most powerful man in the world had died instantly. No lingering, no coma, just the violent punctuation mark of history. Jackie refused to change her clothes. "Let them see what they've done," she said. She stood beside Lyndon Johnson as he was sworn in aboard Air Force One, still covered in her husband's blood. Still in that pink Chanel suit, now more red than pink. America didn't just lose a president that day. It lost its breath. But JFK's tragedy didn't begin with the bullet. It began much earlier. It was braided into his life like a red thread through silk. John Fitzgerald Kennedy had always been dying, in one way or another. He was born sickly, frail, in and out of hospitals. Scarlet fever nearly killed him as a toddler. In his teens, he developed chronic back pain and gastrointestinal issues. By his 20s, he was misdiagnosed with everything from colitis to ulcers to spastic colon. The truth was darker. He had Addison's disease, a rare, incurable adrenal disorder that left him vulnerable to fatigue, infections, and sudden death. He also had osteoporosis in his spine, which led to constant, grinding pain. For most of his adult life, he wore a back brace, took daily injections, swallowed a cocktail of medications. He lived with near-constant discomfort. In public, he seemed youthful and charismatic. In private, he could barely bend over to tie his shoes. The vigor that had defined his campaign? Carefully constructed myth. In the White House, the deception continued. He was photographed playing with his children, sailing off Hyannis Port, dancing at galas. But his daily regimen included steroids, painkillers, barbiturates, and stimulants. His personal physician, Dr. Max Jacobson, nicknamed Dr. Feelgood, gave him shots laced with amphetamines. He functioned through chemistry. And still, he charmed the world. But charisma is not armor, and neither is legacy. In life, John F. Kennedy bore the weight of his name. In death, he became a myth. But behind both stood a family with a curse of its own. Because JFK wasn't the only Kennedy to die young. His older brother, Joseph Kennedy Jr., was the family's original political hope. He died in 1944 during a secret bombing mission over France. His plane exploded mid-air. His remains were never found. His sister, Kathleen "Kick" Kennedy, died in a plane crash in 1948. She was 28. His younger brother, Robert F. Kennedy, was shot in the head in a Los Angeles hotel kitchen in 1968. He died the next day, leaving behind 11 children. Another brother, Ted Kennedy, would survive a car crash in Chappaquiddick that killed a young woman and ended his presidential aspirations. The Kennedy family was American royalty with a Shakespearean body count. Assassinations, accidents, illness. Grief was their family crest. But JFK's own tragedy wasn't just about how he died, or even why. It was the spectacle of it, the finality of it, the way it transformed a generation. Children were sent home from school early that day. Parents wept in living rooms. Television screens flickered with disbelief. Walter Cronkite took off his glasses to deliver the news, his voice cracking with a tremor that rippled through every American home. Then came the funeral. The riderless horse, the black-veiled widow, the salute from little John, 3 years old, lifting his hand to his father's coffin as it passed by. The silence was deafening, and the conspiracy theories began almost immediately. The shooter, Lee Harvey Oswald, a 24-year-old former Marine, arrested hours after the assassination. He denied everything. 2 days later, he was shot on live television by nightclub owner Jack Ruby. He died before he could be tried. The case never closed. It just calcified. Warren Commission, magic bullets, grassy knoll, mafia, CIA, LBJ, Cubans, Soviets, aliens. But strip away the noise, and the story remains simple. A man got into a car. A man smiled and waved, and then he was gone. The bullet shattered not just a life, but the illusion of safety, of progress, of American invincibility. It was the first true mass trauma of the television age. The first time Americans watched, in real time, their leader's head explode on a loop. And for Jackie, it didn't end there. In the years that followed, she would bury her husband's remains beneath an eternal flame at Arlington National Cemetery. She would move to New York. She would marry Aristotle Onassis. But the grief remained. And so did the ghosts. JFK had already buried 2 of their children before his assassination, a stillborn daughter in 1956, and Patrick, born prematurely in 1963, who lived only 2 days. Those small caskets, followed by the state funeral, formed a trinity of loss that no amount of money or status could erase. The tragedy of John F. Kennedy is not just that he died young. It's that we saw it, that we still see it, that we can't look away. But if Kennedy's death marked a sudden, shattering end, the next tragedy would begin long before it ended. A quiet morning, a diary entry, a fire in 2 rooms, and one man who lost everything in a single day. His name was Theodore Roosevelt, and his heartbreak was absolute. Theodore Roosevelt, February 14, 1884. Valentine's Day. The kind of date etched in calendars with hearts and hope, a day of poems and proposals. But for Theodore Roosevelt, it would become the bleakest, bitterest day of his life. It began with a birth and ended with a funeral. It started in a home warm with anticipation and closed in a house so heavy with death that it suffocated even the memory of joy. 2 women died that day. His mother, his wife, hours apart, in the same house, in different rooms. And Theodore Roosevelt, the man of action, the Rough Rider, the trust buster, the bull moose, the charging silhouette carved into Mount Rushmore, was reduced to silence, and then to ink. That night, he opened his diary, scribbled an X across the page, and wrote just a few words. The light has gone out of my life. He never spoke of that day again. To understand why, we have to rewind not to the political firebrand he became, but to the boy who had once gasped for breath on New York's Upper East Side. Young Theodore was sickly, asthmatic, fragile, a prisoner of his own lungs. But from a young age, he fought his weakness like it was a rival to be bested. He boxed, lifted weights, hiked in snowstorms, hunted in freezing forests. He built a body to match the mind he carried. And through it all, there were 2 constants, his mother and his wife. His mother, Martha Bullock Roosevelt, known as Mitty Was, a Southern belle of the old order, fierce, flirty, sharp-tongued, unpredictable. She raised Theodore with a mix of fire and charm, filling the Roosevelt household with stories, contradictions, and a kind of chaotic warmth. His wife, Alice Hathaway Lee Roosevelt, was something else entirely. Alice was radiant. Theodore met her at Harvard. He was awkward, intense, all teeth and spectacles. She was composed, graceful, and endlessly patient. They courted, clumsily at first, but by the time they married in 1880, Theodore was besotted. He called her the light of my life. She laughed at his jokes. She steadied his moods. She made the world seem less like a war. And then she got pregnant. In early 1884, as Alice approached her due date, Theodore's mother Mittie fell ill with what was likely typhoid fever. The Roosevelt house on East 20th Street became a split stage of concern. Upstairs, a woman in labor. Downstairs, a woman dying. On February 12, Alice gave birth to a healthy baby girl. They named her Alice Lee Roosevelt. But something was wrong. Alice, the mother, grew pale. Her fever spiked. The doctors whispered of nephritis Bright's disease, kidney failure, masked by pregnancy. By the next morning, she was slipping away. Mittie died just after midnight. Alice followed that evening. 2 candles extinguished within 12 hours. Theodore held them both as they died. He retreated from public life immediately. He handed his infant daughter to his sister. He fled to the Badlands of the Dakota Territory, seeking something he couldn't name: solitude, distraction, annihilation. He hunted buffalo. He lived in a log cabin. He rode horseback across frozen plains like a ghost wearing boots. He grew a beard. He became a legend. But he never mentioned Alice again. To friends and biographers, he referred to her simply as my young wife, or the dear little girl who died. He never wrote about her in his autobiography. He avoided her name in letters. Even after returning to New York, even after remarrying, even after launching a political career that would catapult him into the White House, he never visited the past. The daughter, Alice Lee, would grow up motherless, raised mostly by Theodore's sister Bamie. She adored her father, but he remained distant, burdened by memory. He refused to speak to her about her mother, ever, not once. And so, a girl grew up with a photograph instead of a mother, and a man carried a silence larger than the West Wing. Later, Roosevelt would remarry Edith Kermit Caro, a childhood friend. They had 5 children together. A second act, a new family, the rough edges sanded slightly by time. But February 14 never changed. Every year, he would grow quiet. He would visit the grave. He would remember in silence. Even as he became the face of American masculinity, charging up San Juan Hill, giving speeches with a bullet in his chest, grinning with a mouth full of metaphors, there was always that room, that diary, that X. When Roosevelt became president in 1901, after the assassination of William McKinley, he brought with him the momentum of a man who had already survived apocalypse. He governed with ferocity, energy, bravado. But those close to him knew, beneath the roar, there was a wound that had never closed. His daughter Alice grew into a wild socialite, sharp-witted, rebellious, impossible to ignore. She smoked in public, carried a snake in her purse, cut through Washington with a wit so venomous it could stop conversation. When asked why she behaved that way, she replied, "If you haven't got anything nice to say about anyone, come sit next to me." The world called her charming. Her father called her a handful. But he also called her his joy. Though he never said the words, never made the connection, some suspected that Alice's very presence, the daughter of his first love, the mirror of the woman who died, kept his ghosts close. When Roosevelt died in 1919, at the age of 60, his body gave out quietly in his sleep. A clot, a final collapse. "The old lion is dead," one of his sons said, but he hadn't really been whole since 1884. Because you can survive anything, even the death of a wife, a mother, a home, but you never really come back. You move forward, you rebuild, you mask the ache with achievement. But some diary pages don't turn, and some entries never get written. Theodore Roosevelt's tragedy wasn't in war, or politics, or scandal. It wasn't in death. It was in what he lost long before the world started watching. And in the silence he carried with him to the grave. But while Roosevelt wore his grief beneath a mask of vigor, the next man bore his sorrow like an open wound draw, unhealed, and often bleeding onto everyone around him. His name was Andrew Jackson, and vengeance was only part of the story. Andrew Jackson. Grief wore spurs in Andrew Jackson's world. It didn't whisper. It howled. It rode beside him through every phase of life, from the backwoods of the Carolinas to the halls of the White House. It struck young, struck often, and never really let go. Jackson's story is not simply one of battles and ballots, but of constant, compounding personal loss. By the time he reached the presidency, the man was less a politician than a fortress held together by scar tissue and vengeance. He was born in 1767 into a land soaked in tension. The American colonies were still British, the revolution not yet lit. His father died before he was born. His mother raised him in a rough cabin near the border of North and South Carolina, a frontier child in a world where violence was the native language. By age 13, he was a courier for the Continental Army. Then came the war. Captured by the British, young Andrew was slashed across the face and hanged by a redcoat officer after refusing to polish the man's boots. That scar stayed with him. So did the trauma. He contracted smallpox in captivity. His older brother, Hugh, died of heat exhaustion during the war. His other brother, Robert, died from wounds and disease contracted in the same prison camp. His mother secured his release, then volunteered to nurse other soldiers. She died of cholera soon after. By 14, Andrew Jackson had lost his entire immediate family. Fatherless, motherless, brotherless. He stood alone at the edge of a broken republic, orphaned not by accident, but by war. That loneliness etched itself into his soul. He grew up fast, meaner, hungrier. He became a lawyer, a soldier, a duelist, a planter. He was quick to anger and quicker to violence. His temper was infamous. His sense of honor, absolute. He fought duels actual, pistols at dawn, duels with a body count. He carried 2 bullets in his body for most of his adult life, lodged in his chest and shoulder from these confrontations. They caused him chronic pain and coughing fits so violent they sometimes drew blood. But there was one person who softened him, Rachel Donaldson Robards. When they met, she was already married unhappily to another man. They fell in love, and she believed herself divorced. They married. Then they discovered the divorce wasn't final. A second ceremony followed, this time legal, but the damage was done. The rumors never stopped. Throughout Jackson's political rise, opponents weaponized Rachel's past against her. They called her an adulteress. They attacked her morality, her virtue, her faith. The 1828 presidential election was one of the dirtiest in history. Rachel bore the brunt of it. She collapsed under the strain. In December 1828, just weeks after Jackson won the presidency, Rachel suffered a heart attack. She died before she could see him sworn in. Jackson blamed the press, blamed the politicians, blamed the entire machinery of public life. He was inconsolable. At her funeral, he stood over her coffin and said, "May God Almighty forgive her murderers. I never can." He buried her in a white dress what she would have worn to his inauguration. And he carried her grief into the White House. Literally. He moved into the executive mansion with a portrait of Rachel hung prominently, her image watching over him as he governed. He refused to remarry. He referred to her as "my dearest heart," long after she had been buried. His letters to friends were haunted by her absence. Visitors to the White House noted the somber air, the floral arrangements always fresh beneath Rachel's picture, the quiet, sharp way Jackson corrected anyone who spoke of her in the past tense. She wasn't gone. Not to him. And she wasn't the only ghost he carried. Jackson's health was a battlefield. The bullets from his duels never healed. One was lodged so deeply in his chest that it regularly became infected, forming abscesses that had to be drained. His lungs were scarred, likely from tuberculosis. His digestive system was ravaged by dysentery and chronic pain. He often coughed up blood. He barely ate. By the end of his life, he weighed under 140 pounds, much of it rage and grit. He suffered constantly. Still, he worked. Still, he fought. Still, he endured. And death didn't stop knocking. He adopted multiple children. Only one biological child of his own survived infancy. Most of his extended family, adopted or blood, died before him. Cholera, war, miscarriage, heart failure. The 19th century was cruel to families. Jackson's life was a long procession of caskets. And through it all, his public persona remained fierce, determined, unyielding. But privately he bled. His letters are soaked in mourning, not just for Rachel, but for his mother, his brothers, his lost children. He spoke often of heaven, of reunions in the afterlife. For all his fury in this world, he was obsessed with the next. As president, he was never far from memory. The White House became a tomb. Behind the politics, the policies, the proclamations, there was a man haunted, not by failure, but by loss. He didn't fear dying. He feared forgetting. He feared being forgotten. In his final years, retired at the Hermitage in Tennessee, Jackson's body continued to betray him. He was bent and thin, coughing up blood between sentences. His hands shook. He kept Rachel's Bible by his bed and her portrait above his fireplace. He died in 1845, at age 78. His final words were whispered through a fog of pain. "Be good children, and we shall all meet in heaven." The man who had outdueled rivals, outlasted war, and outshouted Congress died quietly, surrounded by memories more vivid than the people in the room. Andrew Jackson lived like a thunderstorm and died like a prayer. His tragedy wasn't only that he lost Rachel. It was that he had never stopped losing. The dual scars, the coughing fits, the open wounds, they weren't just physical. They were grief, made permanent. But if Jackson's losses were loud-marked by gunpowder and heartbreaker, next figure suffered in the shadows. An architect of a nation, a philosopher king with a bleeding ledger. His name was Thomas Jefferson, and his debts went far deeper than money. Thomas Jefferson. He died in debt, not metaphorically, not spiritually, literally. One of the most brilliant minds of his generation, author of the Declaration of Independence, polymath, inventor, architect, philosopher, died owing what would be the modern equivalent of millions. And he died alone in a house that was crumbling around him, its plaster flaking like dry skin, its gardens wilting under the Virginia sun, its rooms haunted not by ghosts but by absence. Thomas Jefferson's tragedy didn't strike all at once. It was not a bullet or a burst or a sudden plunge from power. It was slower, more insidious. A gradual decay, like the rot in the wood of Monticello's great beams. It crept in through the margins of ledger books. It bled into love letters. It carved its name into headstones. It began, as many tragedies do, with a woman. Martha Wayles Skelton Jefferson was everything he needed. Witty, literate, passionate. They played music together, he on the violin, she on the harpsichord. Their marriage was quiet but close. Their correspondence tender. She bore him 6 children. And then she started to die. She had always been frail, Pregnancy after pregnancy took its toll. The losses piled up. Of their 6 children, only 2 lived past early childhood. The rest died as infants or toddlers, wrapped in muslin and buried on the plantation. Martha herself, weakened from childbirth, died in 1782 at the age of 33. Her final illness was long and torturous. Jefferson sat by her side, taking notes on her condition, reading to her, holding her hand. She asked him never to remarry. He promised. And he kept that promise. But he didn't keep her. After her death, Jefferson fell apart. He wrote of a stupor of mind which it was my fate often to experience. He stayed in his room for weeks. He wandered Monticello like a ghost. He rode for hours through the hills, sometimes alone, sometimes with his daughter, seeking motion to outrun the stillness. The man who had helped write a new nation couldn't finish a sentence without collapsing. And then came Paris. Appointed as minister to France, Jefferson threw himself into diplomacy, trying to reassemble the fragments of his life into a workable mosaic. He wrote letters, read books, observed the stirrings of revolution, but he was still broken. He poured himself into his surviving daughter, Martha Jefferson Randolph, and controversially, privately formed a relationship with Sally Hemings, a young enslaved woman in his household who bore him multiple children. These personal complexities would remain veiled for most of his lifetime. What remained publicly visible was the image of a man surrounded by brilliance but haunted by burial plots. Because the deaths didn't stop. His second surviving daughter, Maria Polly Jefferson, died at 25, shortly after childbirth. His grandson drowned at 21. He lost siblings. He lost grandchildren. Monticello became not just a home, but a cemetery in slow motion. And the house, his masterpiece, his architectural jewel, became a physical manifestation of his personal decline. Jefferson had built Monticello as a dreamscape, every room measured, every window mathematically aligned. He filled it with busts of philosophers, books in every language, artifacts of science and culture. He invented devices to improve it: dumbwaiters, clocks, weather vanes. It was a house of reason. And yet, reason could not stop the bleeding. His finances were a slow-moving train wreck. He was a poor manager. He overspent on rare books, imported wines, renovations. The plantation's soil grew exhausted. The debts from his father-in-law's estate dragged him down like weights on a swimmer's ankles. And slavery, on which his entire estate depended, was both the foundation and the moral sinkhole beneath his feet. He couldn't escape it. He didn't try. By the time he retired from public life, Jefferson was drowning. He sold books to Congression's personal library to help rebuild the Library of Congress after the War of 1812. He called it a gift. It was also a fire sale. And still, the debts mounted. He wrote letter after letter begging for loans, asking for extensions, pleading for patience. His name, so grand in public, had become a liability in private. Lenders circled like crows. He watched his grandchildren marry without dowries. He watched Monticello decay. The paint peeled, the nails rusted, the fields stopped yielding. The enslaved workforce grew older, their labor still taken, their lives still counted in ledgers. He kept writing. He corresponded with John Adams in his later years. The two old men, once rivals, now wrote long, tender letters about memory, time, death. Their letters were full of wit, but also weariness. They knew what was coming. And then, the irony. July 4, 1826. The 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson, now 83, lay in his bed at Monticello, too weak to stand. He had been slipping in and out of consciousness for days. The house was quiet. The family stood vigil. The man who had penned "All men are created equal" could barely speak. He died just past noon. Unbeknownst to him, John Adams had died earlier that day within hours. His last words, "Thomas Jefferson survives." He was wrong. The country marked the dual deaths with awe. Two founding fathers. Same day, same legacy, same slow decline. After his death, Monticello was sold, his possessions auctioned, his enslaved people over 130 were sold off or inherited. His name lived on in statues and textbooks. But the man had been hollowed by debt, by loss, by the relentless chisel of mortality. His descendants struggled. Some tried to reclaim his legacy. Others faded into history. The tragedies remained, engraved not in marble, but in the paper trail of unpaid bills and premature obituaries. Thomas Jefferson's story is not simply about greatness. It's about erosion. Of fortune, of family, of flesh. He built a house to touch the sky and died in its shadow. He lit a flame for liberty and spent a lifetime watching it flicker, and the weight of that contradiction never lifted. From the philosopher who fell beneath the burden of his own brilliance, we turn to another man brought low not by ideas, but by the frailty of the human body. His name was Woodrow Wilson, and he governed from behind a curtain of silence. Woodrow Wilson. October 2, 1919, Washington, D.C. The president was missing. Behind the thick curtains of the White House, the hallways had gone unusually quiet. Staff whispered. Doctors came and went. A bedroom door stayed closed. And inside, slumped in bed, half paralyzed, was the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, his mind flickering like an old lantern, his body crumpled by a stroke that no one in the country would learn about until it was far too late. It had happened suddenly. Wilson had just returned from an exhausting cross-country speaking tour, a grueling 80-mile crusade to rally public support for the Treaty of Versailles and his brainchild, the League of Nations. He had pushed himself hard, too hard. He gave dozens of speeches in dozens of cities, riding on rails and running on fumes. His face grew pale, his eye twitched, his appetite vanished. By the time he returned to Washington, his wife Edith noticed something was wrong. Then came the stroke. It wasn't minor. It struck with the ferocity of a freight train. It left the right side of his body paralyzed, his mouth twisted, his vision blurred, his speech slurred, his mind intermittently clouded. The president, the man elected by millions, the commander-in-chief, the world statesman, could no longer walk unaided. He couldn't hold a pen. At times, he couldn't speak. And the American people had no idea. What followed was a cover-up that bordered on operatic tragedy. The inner circle closed ranks. Access to the president was restricted. No meetings, no public appearances, no press conferences, only filtered reports, carefully curated by his doctors and his wife. The truth was too terrifying to admit. The President of the United States was incapacitated. So, Edith Wilson took over. Officially, she was the First Lady. Unofficially, she became the acting executive of the nation. She decided which messages reached the president. She chose which issues warranted his limited attention. She filtered memos, selected appointees, shielded him from stress, and in some cases, responded in his name. It was not a formal assumption of power. There was no constitutional mechanism for such a transfer. But it happened, quietly, stealthily, for 17 months. It was perhaps the longest period of presidential incapacity in American history and the least discussed. Edith called it stewardship. Others called it shadow governance. But regardless of the name, the reality remained. Wilson was no longer capable of fulfilling the duties of his office. And yet, he stayed in power. The government functioned, barely. Congress operated. The cabinet limped along, but key initiatives faltered. The League of Nations Wilson's dream of preventing future world wars was rejected by the Senate. He was too sick to rally for it, too weakened to negotiate, too broken to bend. And beneath the political collapse was the body of a man who had never truly been well. Wilson had a history of health issues long before his stroke. He had suffered from hypertension for years, as well as small undiagnosed strokes, what were then called nervous attacks. He experienced long periods of fatigue, double vision, migraines, and numbness. The warning signs had been there, blinking like hazard lights. But the demands of war, peace, and power never allowed him to stop. World War I had taken a toll not just on the globe, but on the man trying to glue it back together. Wilson's collapse was not just a physical failure, it was an emotional one. His mind, once razor-sharp, began to falter. He grew suspicious, irritable, occasionally delusional. Once methodical, he now spoke in fragments. He fixated on details, replayed conversations, forgot names. And, still, he remained president. Because there was no plan for this. No 25th Amendment. No clear protocol for what to do when a leader could no longer lead. His doctors lied. His staff complied. And Edith Wilson, formidable, intelligent, untrained, kept the machinery of the presidency running on sheer determination. For a while, but the costs mounted. Allies drifted, enemies pounced. Wilson's reputation, once towering on the world stage, began to fray. And he, once a master orator, now spent most of his days in bed, propped up by pillows, gazing silently out the window. He wrote a few letters. He signed a few documents. But the man was not the man anymore. When his term ended in 1921, he did not attend the inauguration of his successor, Warren G. Harding. He watched it from the White House, too weak to stand. Hours later, he was driven to his new home in the Kalorama neighborhood of Washington, a broken remnant of what he had once been. There, in the shadow of his former glory, he lived out his final years. The house was quiet. His health remained fragile. His once booming voice now wavered in a whisper. He rarely left. He saw few people. He wrote occasional notes, dictated letters. But mostly, he faded. He died on February 3, 1924. He was 67. No pomp, no parade. A modest funeral, a quiet burial. He remains the only U.S. president buried in Washington, D.C. The man who had tried to reshape the world, who had redrawn maps and preached peace through collective strength, died a figure of mystery and fragility, remembered not only for what he built, but for what he couldn't hold together. But the real tragedy? No one stepped in. No one stopped it. The system had no answer for a dying man in the most powerful seat on earth. And he wasn't the last. Because the next story is about another man who faced the quiet enemy of the flesh, who spent his final years not trying to win a war, but to beat a clock. He was a general once, and now, bankrupt, diseased, and dying, he had only one mission left. His name was Ulysses S. Grant, and he would write until his hands gave out. Ulysses S. Grant. The pain started in his throat, a persistent rawness. He brushed it off at first, probably just a cold, maybe a bit of indigestion. After all, he'd smoked cigars his entire adult life. He'd chewed them, lit them, passed them between his fingers like rosary beads in the quiet before battles. Sometimes he smoked 20 a day. The smoke was more habit than pleasure by then. He didn't think much of it. But by 1884, the pain had become something else. Ulysses S. Grant, former general, former president, and once the most respected man in America, was dying. He didn't know it for sure yet, but his body did. He could feel it. His mouth burned when he swallowed. His voice grew hoarse. His appetite waned, and then the worst symptom of all his finances collapsed. It happened quickly, like a house of cards kicked by a cruel foot. He had been duped. After his presidency, Grant had partnered with a man named Ferdinand Ward Young, charismatic, and, as it turned out, catastrophically untrustworthy. Together, they launched a Wall Street investment firm, Grant, Ward. Ward promised safe, profitable returns, claimed to have inside connections. Grant, trusting and inexperienced in business, handed over not only his own savings, but the trust of friends and family who followed his lead. Then the bottom fell out. In May 1884, Ward's Ponzi scheme unraveled. The firm went bankrupt overnight. Grant was left penniless. Worse, he had borrowed money from others to prop up what he believed was a legitimate business. Now he owed them and couldn't pay. The man who had once commanded 500,000 troops and twice held the highest office in the land could barely afford groceries. His wife, Julia, pawned family heirlooms. Friends took up quiet collections. He was too proud to ask, but too broke to refuse. Then came the diagnosis. Cancer. Doctors discovered a tumor at the base of his tongue, the kind that crept upward into the sinuses, downward into the throat, wrapping itself around the nerves and tissue like a serpent. It was inoperable. It was terminal. There was nothing anyone could do. And so, faced with death, Grant made a decision. He would write. Not letters, not essays. A book. A memoir. He would turn his life into a document, his words into currency, his memories into legacy. He would do it for Julia, for their children, for the debts he could not repay. And he would do it fast because the cancer was not waiting. Mark Twain stepped in to help. Twain, already an icon, knew Grant needed more than a standard publishing contract. He offered him 70% of the royalties an astonishing rate. He provided support, editors, a team, but the words were Grant's. Every line, every memory, every paragraph. He wrote longhand, in notebooks, in bed, by lamplight. His handwriting grew shakier as the disease progressed. He took morphine for the pain, cocaine-based lozenges to numb his throat. He couldn't eat. He barely drank. He lived on eggs and broth, his weight dropping below 120 pounds. And still, he wrote. The personal memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant became his battlefield. He recounted his youth, his time at West Point, his struggles in civilian life. But mostly, he wrote about the war, about Vicksburg, about Shiloh, about Appomattox, about Lincoln, about the men he led and the ones who didn't come back. He wrote plainly, without flourish. Military prose, sharp, clean, honest. The voice of a man who had seen too much to exaggerate. As summer approached, he moved to a mountaintop cottage in Saratoga County, New York, Mount McGregor, hoping the cooler air would ease his suffering. By then, he could barely speak. He communicated with notepads and whispers. He was too weak to sit for long periods. Every page was a labor. He had lost the use of his tongue, but not his will. His family sat nearby, reading drafts, bringing him ink and water. Twain visited. So did doctors, though they could do nothing except ease the pain. Grant's neck was visibly swollen, his face sunken, but the fire in his eyes remained. The work neared completion. He was writing not just to pay debts, but to leave behind something unbroken, something worthy. On July 18, 1885, he finished the manuscript. 4 days later, he died. He was 63. The nation mourned. Over 1 million people lined the streets of New York City for his funeral procession. His casket, draped in stars and stripes, was drawn through the city by black-plumed horses. Union generals walked beside Confederate ones, former enemies, now bound by shared loss. His body was interred in a temporary vault until Grant's tomb, the largest mausoleum in North America, was completed. But the real monument was the book. Published shortly after his death, Personal Memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant became an instant bestseller. Twain had 350, zero advance orders. The royalties erased Grant's debts. Julia received nearly $500,000 in today's currency, enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life. And the book was more than a financial success. It was a masterpiece. Grant's memoirs were praised for their clarity, their candor, their restraint. No self-pity, no grandstanding, just the truth, told straight. It set the standard for presidential writing: stoic, human, vivid. But beneath the prose lay a deeper story. A man, once revered, had been stripped of everything: money, health, dignity, and yet in his final year had rebuilt his legacy from nothing but pain and memory. He didn't complain. He didn't panic. He didn't quit. He wrote, "That was how Ulysses S. Grant faced death. Not on a battlefield, not in glory, but in silence, hunched over pages that would outlive him." His final victory wasn't over the South. It was over oblivion. And yet, just as Grant's story ends with a pen in hand, the next begins with a silent scream, because the next president knew what it meant to lose a child, not in war, not in adulthood, but in the cruel randomness of summer play. A blister, a funeral, a boy named Calvin Jr., and the father left behind was Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge. They say he never smiled again. Not really. Not the way he used to. Calvin Coolidge was never the laughing sort to begin with. Not in the public eye. Dubbed Silent Cal, he was a man of restraint, economical with words, composed to the point of stillness. He once famously remarked, "If you don't say anything, you won't be called on to repeat it." Reporters joked that he communicated in raised eyebrows and nods. His speeches were short. His handshake, firm but brief. But in private, before July 1924, there had been a flicker, a soft, dry humor, a twinkle when he looked at his sons, especially Calvin Jr., his youngest. Then came the blister. It began with the game of tennis. Just that. A summer day on the White House lawn, Calvin Jr., 16 years old, thin and quick with a sharp grin, played barefoot in the heat. It was the 4th of July weekend. There were guests, laughter. The world felt secure. The son of the president serving volleys under the shadow of the executive mansion. But tennis shoes exist for a reason. By evening, a blister had formed on Calvin Jr.'s toe. By the next day, it had become infected. Within 72 hours, the infection had entered his bloodstream. Septicemia. A word that sounds clinical, detached, cold. But what it really meant was that his body was failing: veins, filling with poison, organs shutting down. Antibiotics didn't exist yet. The doctors could do little more than watch. They lanced the blister. They applied antiseptics. They prayed. Coolidge didn't leave his son's side. He watched the color drain from Calvin Jr.'s face, watched the fever spike, watched as hope slipped away one medical chart at a time. The boy died on July 7, 1924. 3 days after a game of tennis. 3 days after a blister. The President of the United States, a man who had taken the oath after the sudden death of Warren G. Harding, now sat helpless in the face of a far smaller, crueler tragedy. His son was gone, and something inside Coolidge left with him. It's tempting to describe Calvin Coolidge as emotionless. That was his reputation, the stoic New Englander, unmoved by fanfare or grief. But the truth was sharper than that. He wasn't emotionless. He was simply broken. Coolidge returned to work almost immediately. He was running for re-election. He gave speeches, attended meetings. The public saw no deviation in his manner, no break in the marble facade. But those closest to him saw it. His wife, Grace, said she would find him staring out the window for hours, not reading, not writing, just staring. One night, she caught him in the White House nursery, sitting in the dark, holding a pair of Calvin Jr.'s old shoes. He never spoke of that moment. He just put the shoes down and walked away. In public, he maintained appearances, but his private writings tell the story he never said aloud. In his autobiography, Coolidge wrote, "When he went, the power and the glory of the presidency went with him." He described the death of his son not just as a loss, but as a rupture, something that divided his life into before and after. "I do not know why such a price was exacted for occupying the White House," he wrote, "but it was." He withdrew. He grew quieter, even by his standards. Staff noticed he worked shorter hours. He delegated more. He seemed less interested in the machinery of power. In 1928, despite wide support for another term, he declined to run. He said, with typical brevity, "I do not choose to run for president in 1928. It wasn't ambition that failed him. It was spirit." He returned to Northampton, Massachusetts, took up a quiet life again, wrote editorials, fed the birds, walked with Grace. The world continued to see him as inscrutable, distant. But those who knew better understood. The man who had once believed in the silent dignity of duty had been struck silent in the most devastating way. The years passed. One day in 1933, Coolidge suffered a sudden heart attack while shaving in his bathroom. He collapsed. Grace found him on the floor. He was 60 years old. He was buried next to Calvin Jr. No grand monument, just a modest grave in Vermont, marked by a simple headstone and the quiet hum of trees overhead. And yet, the tragedy didn't end there. For Grace Coolidge, the grief never truly lifted. She lived another 24 years. She kept Calvin Jr.'s photographs on her nightstand, wrote about him often, talked about him rarely. The death of a child is unlike any other. It doesn't just take something from you, it rearranges what remains. For Calvin Coolidge, a man already defined by restraint, it emptied the emotional reserves completely. His presidency continued, but he didn't. His legacy, understated as ever, was built on a foundation cracked by a single summer day. It wasn't war. It wasn't scandal. It wasn't politics. It was a blister. And from that silent wound, we turn to another man who spent the remainder of his life carrying a weight the world never quite understood. A man blamed for a national collapse he didn't cause. A man who gave his island was handed nothing but history's cold shoulder in return. His name was Herbert Hoover. And his tragedy wasn't about death. It was about blame. Herbert Hoover. There are men who die quickly, and there are men who die slowly. For Herbert Hoover, the death came by inches-sewn headline at a time, one stock point at a time, one hollow accusation after another until, by the end of it, a man once seen as a hero of humanity stood as a monument to misfortune. Not because of what he did, but because of what happened on his watch. The irony? He spent his life trying to prevent tragedy, and then he became the face of one. The year was 1928. Hoover, already a global figure, won the presidency in a landslide. The nation was roaring, the markets booming. Jazz floated out of radios. Skyscrapers climbed like steel miracles into the sky. The American dream was on fire, and Herbert Hoover, an engineer by trade, believed he could fine-tune it into something permanent. He was efficient, disciplined, brilliant. And then came October 29, 1929. Black Tuesday. The stock market crashed. Spectacularly. Permanently. In the span of hours, paper fortunes dissolved, brokers jumped from windows, bank vaults emptied, and across the country, the first notes of despair began to play. Factories closed, farms dried up. Paychecks vanished. Lines for bread wrapped around city blocks. The Great Depression had begun. And Hoover, barely 8 months into his presidency, would never escape it. But the tragedy of Herbert Hoover didn't start there. It started with the life he built. Born in 1874 in West Branch, Iowa, to a Quaker family, Hoover was orphaned by the age of 9. His father died of a heart attack. His mother, 3 years later, of pneumonia. He was shipped off to Oregon to live with relatives. There, he worked as a clerk and did chores until he saved enough money to get into Stanford University as a member of its first class. He studied geology, became a mining engineer, and by the early 1900s, he was one of the most successful businessmen in the world. He traveled to Australia, China, Africa, working in mines, managing risks, mapping wealth in the veins of the earth. By the time he was 40, he was rich and restless. So he turned to service. When World War I shattered Europe, Hoover organized the Commission for Relief in Belgium. It was the largest humanitarian effort of its time. He negotiated with the British and Germans, shipped food into war zones, fed millions of starving civilians. The scale was staggering, the complexity unprecedented. By the end of the war, he was called the Great Humanitarian. Then came the U.S. Food Administration, then Secretary of Commerce, and finally, the White House. Herbert Hoover didn't stumble into the presidency. He earned it. But no amount of brilliance could stop the collapse. When the Depression hit, Hoover acted at first with confidence, then with desperation. He met with business leaders, encouraged voluntary cooperation, launched public works projects, including the construction of what would later be called the Hoover Dam. He tried to shore up banks, created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to inject federal money into struggling sectors. But nothing worked fast enough. The economy kept unraveling. People lost everything. And then came the names. Shantytowns were called Hoovervilles. Empty pockets turned inside out were Hoover flags. Newspapers used as blankets? Hoover blankets. He became a symbol not of leadership, but of failure. He didn't cause the crash, but he couldn't stop it. And that's what history remembered. In 1932, he lost re-election to Franklin D. Roosevelt in one of the most lopsided defeats in American history. He returned to private life bitter, stunned, vilified. He had entered the White House as a humanitarian and left it as a punchline. But he didn't vanish. He couldn't. Instead, he endured. He wrote speeches, memoirs, letters. Over the next 3 decades, he published more than 40 books. He studied history. He defended his record, sometimes bitterly, sometimes defensively, always passionately. And slowly, painfully, the public began to see the man again. Not the caricature. The man. During World War II, Franklin Roosevelt, his political nemesis, called him back into public service to coordinate food relief again. Hoover didn't hesitate. He helped plan feeding programs for war-torn Europe. He organized the distribution of supplies in Asia. He met with generals, kings, presidents. He was 70, then 75, then 80. He never stopped working. In 1000, 947, President Harry Truman asked him to head a commission to reorganize the federal government. Hoover accepted. Again, he served. Again, he tried to make things better. And though many had forgotten the bitterness of the early 1930s, Hoover hadn't. The wounds never closed. He once told a friend, "I can only hope that in future years Americans will come to understand that my heart was broken." The public had short memories. Hoover did not. His wife, Lou Henry Hoover, died in 1944. She had been his partner in everything, his translator, his editor, his equal. After her death, he lived alone in the Waldorf Astoria in New York City, writing late into the night, his typewriter clacking through the hours. Visitors said he kept her picture on his desk. He never remarried. His final years were spent trying to explain, not to the world, to history. Because Herbert Hoover had been misunderstood in real time, but he hoped desperately, maybe even naively, that the record could be corrected. He died in 1964. He was 90. He had outlived every other man who had ever held the presidency. Outlived the Depression. Outlived 2 world wars. Outlived Roosevelt. He was buried in West Branch, Iowa, beside Lou, beneath the prairie sky. A quiet grave. A complicated life. But the tragedy of Herbert Hoover wasn't just that he was blamed. It's that he never stopped blaming himself. Even when others tried to forgive. Even when time softened the verdict. He never did. And from the man who bore his nation's scorn and silence, we turn to one who never let defeat define him. A man who lost the presidency, won it again, and lost even more. His name was John Quincy Adams. And his tragedy was not in how he lived, but in how little anyone seemed to care. John Quincy Adams. Some men chase power, others inherit it, but John Quincy Adams was born into it, a child of revolution, raised not just among the founding fathers but by one. He was 8 years old when the Declaration of Independence was signed. 10 when he watched musket fire light the horizon near Bunker Hill. 13 when he sailed to Europe as his father's secretary, learning diplomacy before he learned to shave. He was fluent in Latin and Greek before most boys could read a map. By the time he was 17, he was writing dispatches from the court of Catherine the Great. A prodigy, a polymath, a president. And yet, John Quincy Adams is remembered less for what he accomplished than for how bitterly he was misunderstood. His tragedy wasn't death. It wasn't disease. It was the long, slow agony of unfulfilled potential, of brilliance ignored, of effort unrewarded, of truth left unread in dusty bookshelves. His story began in shadows. Born in 1767 to John and Abigail Adams, John Quincy Adams grew up in the crucible of American identity. His father was a future president, his mother an intellect of sharp edges and deep resolve. Expectations were not suggested, they were branded into his name. He studied in Paris and Leiden, attended Harvard, read voraciously, spoke multiple languages. He was the child forged to lead. And for a while, he did. He became a lawyer, a senator, a diplomat. By the time James Monroe tapped him as Secretary of State, Adams was already the architect behind the Monroe Doctrine, a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy. He negotiated treaties, diffused crises. His intelligence was precise, his memory surgical. He was, as one contemporary put it, the ablest man in public life. And so, in 1824, he ran for president. What followed was chaos. 4 major candidates entered the race: Adams, Andrew Jackson, William H. Crawford, and Henry Clay. Jackson won the most electoral votes, but not a majority. The decision went to the House of Representatives. Clay threw his support behind Adams, who won the presidency. Adams then appointed Clay as Secretary of State. Jackson's supporters cried foul. "Corrupt bargain!" they screamed, and the echo never faded. John Quincy Adams entered the presidency under a cloud of suspicion. Though never proven, the damage was done. His administration was marked not by corruption, but by paralysis. Every initiative, every proposal, was met with resistance. He wanted to build roads, establish a national university, fund scientific research projects ahead of their time. Congress said no, repeatedly, often spitefully. The most capable man in the country found himself shackled by politics. He detested campaigning, refused to glad hand, wrote speeches few understood. He believed the presidency should be earned, not performed. But in an era shifting toward populism and spectacle, he was a relic, an 18th century brain in a 19th century circus. In 1828, he ran for re-election against Andrew Jackson. He lost, decisively. It was a humiliating defeat. But here is where the tragedy sharpens into something more complicated. Because Adams didn't vanish. He didn't retreat into memoirs or mansions. He went back to work. In 1830, he ran for Congress. He won. He became the only former president in American history to return to the House of Representatives. And he stayed there for the rest of his life. 17 more years. As a representative. Fighting. Not for legacy. For principle. He became a thorn in the side of complacency. A tireless voice against slavery. A critic of expansionist wars. He fought for the right to petition, for freedom of speech, for the dignity of debate. He spoke often, at length, and with a fury born not of ambition, but of conviction. He was nicknamed Old Man Eloquent, and he wore the name like armor. But he was not universally admired. Many despised him, saw him as pompous, difficult, sanctimonious. And in truth, Adams could be all those things. He had no patience for mediocrity, no talent for charm. He once described the Senate as a hospital of incurables. He wrote more than 0 pages in his diary. He trusted almost no one. He aged alone. His wife, Louisa, suffered from depression. Their children struggled. His son George committed suicide in 1829, a month after Adams lost the presidency. His other sons battled alcoholism, financial ruin, and personal failure. The Adams name became a burden, but still he worked. And then, on February 21, 1848, in the Capitol building, he collapsed. He had risen to speak against honoring Mexican war generals with ceremonial swords. He never finished the sentence. He was carried to the speaker's room, where he lay unconscious for 2 days. On February 23, he died. His last words, "This is the last of earth. I am content." He was 80 years old. He died on the floor of the institution he had spent his life trying to improve. The House passed a resolution in his honor. Members wept. Political enemies offered tributes. But outside Washington, the country barely paused. No parades. No mourning in the streets. He had been a forgotten president, a cantankerous congressman, a man whose vision was too complex for campaign slogans. But in death, as in life, he stood tall. His legacy? Not written in boldface, but in footnotes. He argued the Amistad case before the Supreme Court and won. He opposed the gag rule that silenced anti-slavery petitions and helped repeal it. He showed that a president could fail and still serve. That honor didn't require applause. That principle didn't require power. John Quincy Adams's tragedy wasn't that he died in public. It's that he lived largely unrecognized. A statesman with the mind of a philosopher and the heart of a warrior, trapped in a political system that prized neither. And yet, he kept fighting, even when no one was watching. And now, from the quiet dignity of a man who served until his last breath, we step into the life of another one whose loss was far more personal. A man whose family was torn apart before he ever took the oath. A man named Joe Biden. And his tragedy began before he ever held the keys to the White House. Joe Biden. He was 30 years old, the youngest newly elected senator in the United States Senate. His name was in newspapers, his face on local broadcasts. He had just won an improbable race in Delaware, flipping a long-held Republican seat with little money and a lot of hustle. The headlines should have been about the future, a rising star, a new era. But instead, they were about a phone call. December 18, 1972. 2 days before Christmas, Joe Biden was in Washington, assembling his new staff, getting ready to move his young family from Wilmington to the capital. His wife, Nelia, was out with their children Naomi, Bo, and Hunter buying a Christmas tree. Then the phone rang. A tractor-trailer had struck their station wagon at an intersection. Witnesses said the car rolled into the truck's path. The impact was immediate. Nelia was killed instantly. So was their 1-year-old daughter, Naomi. Bo and Hunter, just 3 and 2 years old, were both badly injured. And just like that, Biden became a senator-elect and a widower in the same breath. He would later say, "For the first time in my life, I understood how someone could consciously decide to commit suicide." He didn't, but he came close. For weeks, he wandered the halls of the hospital where his sons lay recovering, often late at night, his tie loosened, his face slack. He kept vigil over their broken bodies, slept in a cot between their beds. He didn't go home. There was no home to go to. He considered resigning, called party leaders, said he couldn't do it. Couldn't serve while his heart was still crushed beneath the wheels of what had happened. They begged him to reconsider. He agreed, barely. He was sworn in at the hospital bedside of his son's unprecedented act, his left hand on the Bible, his right gripping the handrail of a hospital crib. Cameras flashed. He looked like a man frozen mid-fall. And for the next decade, he took the train. Every day. From Wilmington to Washington. 4 hours round trip, just to be home with his boys every night. Amtrak became his therapy. The rhythmic clatter of steel his metronome of mourning. He called himself a single dad in the Senate. Voted, then vanished. Committee meetings, then Cub Scout meetings. Foreign policy briefings, then flu shots and school plays. He remarried in 1977, Jill Jacobs, a teacher, a stabilizing force. She brought laughter back into the house, color back into the corners of Biden's grief. Together, they built a new family, raised the boys, created new traditions, new Christmases. But grief doesn't die. It waits. In 1988, Biden collapsed while giving a speech, a brain aneurysm, then another. He underwent 2 emergency surgeries, spent months in recovery. His doctors told him if either had ruptured in different directions, he would have died instantly, or lost speech or motor function. He survived, barely. He returned to the Senate, re-entered the fray, and then, decades later, another knock at the door. In 2015, his son Bohis, golden child, the one everyone said looked like Joe but thought like Jill, a rising politician, a veteran of the Iraq War. The Attorney General of Delaware was diagnosed with brain cancer, glioblastoma, the same kind that had killed Ted Kennedy. Bo fought. Surgery, chemo, radiation, clinical trials. He gave speeches with wires under his suit. campaigned for others while his vision blurred and his speech slowed. Joe sat by his bed again, like he had decades earlier. In 2015, Bo died at the age of 46, and Joe broke. Publicly this time. He wept at the podium, at vigils, at eulogies. He receded from politics, declined to run for president in 2016, said the timing was wrong, but what he meant was, I can't do it again. Not without him. Bo was supposed to be the one. The bridge between the Biden story and the next generation. He was gone. The cancer had come quickly and cruelly, and the grief returned like it had never left. Joe Biden's life reads like a ledger of loss, not in one great blaze, but in a slow sequence of cruelty. Wife, daughter, son, health, hope. Again and again, life stepped in and shattered the frame just as he was starting to fill it. And still, he rose. He kept going. He wrote a memoir. Promise me, Dad. The title came from Bo, a plea to keep going, to stay engaged, to live. The book is not political. It's not even chronological. It's a series of moments, like flashbulbs in the dark, chronicling the days between hope and heartbreak. It's a father talking to a ghost. But Biden didn't just survive. He served. He returned to public life, campaigned, gave speeches about grief, not policy, hugged strangers who had lost children, called widows, wrote letters to cancer patients. His calendar filled with funerals and fundraisers. He became, almost unintentionally, the country's consoler-in-chief. And the tragedies didn't stop at family. His surviving son, Hunter, struggled with addiction, alcohol, cocaine, the chaos of trauma transmuted into impulse. Biden never disowned him, never dodged the questions. He said once, "My son has never given up on me. I will never give up on him." Loss, in his world, was not just a chapter. It was a co-author. It wrote on his face. It sat with him at the dinner table. It shaped how he saw everything: power, purpose, even politics. He became a man who cried openly, who eulogized friends, who talked not of vengeance but of absence. By the time he was elected President of the United States, Joe Biden had already survived more personal loss than any commander-in-chief in modern history. He took the oath of office not just as a statesman, but as a survivor. The boy from Delaware who took a train back to two broken boys. The father who held a baby coffin. The man who whispered goodbye to a grown son in a hospital room. His presidency would come later, but his tragedy was already complete. And still, the story of presidential grief doesn't end with funerals and farewells. Sometimes it comes in the form of scandal, of secrets buried beneath a smile. And the next man would die suddenly, surrounded by whispers. His name was Warren G. Harding, and his greatest tragedy may never have fully come to light. Warren G. Harding. It started with exhaustion, whispers of fatigue, talks of overwork. A nation still reeling from war and pandemic wanted peace, wanted prosperity, and into that silence came Warren Gamaliel Hardinga, man with a warm baritone voice, a handshake like an old friend, and a campaign built around a single, unassuming word: normalcy. But nothing about Harding's life or his death would be normal. He was 55 years old when he took the oath of office in 1921. A former newspaper publisher from Ohio, he had ascended to the highest office with a wave of post-war optimism behind him. The roaring 20s were knocking at the door. The country was ready to dance again. And Harding, with his broad grin and affable charm, seemed to promise stability after years of upheaval. But beneath the surface, cracks were already forming. He wasn't well. In private, he complained of chest pain. of indigestion, of shortness of breath. He had high blood pressure, palpitations. His doctors, a revolving door of old friends, political appointees, and medical men of uneven quality, dismissed his symptoms as stress, or nerves, or diet. He drank heavily, smoked cigars, rarely slept enough, and often buried his worry beneath bourbon and bonhomie. He told his wife, Florence, that he feared he wouldn't survive the presidency. He wasn't wrong, but the tragedy of Warren G. Harding wasn't just medical. It was historical. He governed amid a storm of duplicity. The very people he trusted, appointed, embraced, laughed with, were robbing the country blind. The Ohio Gang, as they came to be known, were a cabal of cronies who used Harding's good nature as cover for greed. There was the Veterans Bureau scandal, the Justice Department corruption, and then the mother of them all, the Teapot Dome scandal. Oil leases, bribes, suitcases of cash, millions siphoned under the table, all while Harding smiled from the podium. And while historians debate how much he knew, one thing is certain: the weight of it crushed him. By 1923, Harding was unraveling. The public didn't yet know about the scandals, but Harding did. He started traveling, a cross-country tour to reconnect with the people, to get out of Washington, to escape the rumors creeping closer to his office like smoke beneath a locked door. He called it the Voyage of Understanding. It would become his farewell tour. They left Washington in June 1923. Harding, his wife Florence, a group of aides, and a full press corps. They traveled by train, then by ship, across the American West, into Alaska's first sitting president to visit the territory. He gave speeches, waved to crowds, smiled for photos. But those closest to him saw the cracks. He was gaunt, tired, often breathless. He vomited after meals. He clutched his chest and brushed it off. Doctors called it food poisoning, blamed tainted crab, then an upset stomach, then nervous indigestion, but the symptoms were mounting. Still, he pressed on. On July 26, in Seattle, he gave a speech to 0 people, while visibly pale and perspiring. He leaned on the podium, his voice cracked. When he finished, aides had to help him to his car. By the time they reached San Francisco on July 29, Harding could barely rise from bed. Doctors were summoned. Multiple diagnoses were floated: pneumonia, heart disease, stroke. Officially, they said he was recovering. Unofficially, they were preparing for the worst. On the evening of August 2, 1923, Harding was resting in bed at the Palace Hotel. Florence was reading to him an article about his own popularity. He smiled, sighed, and then, without a word, went still. No gasp, no groan. Just gone. The official cause of death was apoplexy, a vague term used at the time for stroke or cerebral hemorrhage. Later, some suggested heart attack. Others, a heart rhythm disorder. There was no autopsy. Florence Harding refused it. She ordered his body embalmed immediately. No second opinions, no post-mortem exploration. The silence was sudden, decisive, and permanent. And so, the questions began. Had he died of natural causes? Or had something else happened? Rumors bloomed in the vacuum of facts. Some speculated he'd been poisoned by Florence herself. Their marriage, though publicly affectionate, had long been rumored to be strained. Florence was strong-willed, deeply protective, and had reportedly grown weary of his infidelities. Because yes, there were those too. Harding had carried on a lengthy affair with Carrie Phillips, the wife of a friend. Their relationship spanned over a decade, passionate, tumultuous, and, later, politically dangerous. She had sympathies for Germany during World War I, and her connection to Harding raised eyebrows in intelligence circles. Then there was Nan Britton, a much younger woman who claimed to have had a years-long relationship with Harding, resulting in a daughter, Elizabeth. At the time, Britton's claims were dismissed as fantasy. Her book, The President's Daughter, was labeled scandalous pulp. Harding had died before the public reckoning. In 2015, nearly a century later, DNA testing confirmed that Elizabeth Ann Britton was indeed Harding's biological daughter. Truth, slow as molasses, had finally caught up. But back in 1923, the president's death was rushed. His funeral was held in Washington, then in his hometown of Marion, Ohio. The nation mourned. The media wept. Harding had been a likable man, a friendly face, a lover of golf and poker and easy laughter. In death, he was lionized. But the statues didn't last long, because the scandals began to leak. One by one, investigations uncovered the rot beneath the surface. Cabinet members indicted, friends imprisoned, his name tarnished, his trust betrayed. Harding's greatest tragedy wasn't that he died suddenly. It was that he died believing the people closest to him were loyal, that his administration would be remembered for peace and prosperity. Instead, his legacy crumbled into cautionary tale. And Florence? She burned his personal papers. No letters, no confessions, no closure. Just ash. She died the following year. And so, Warren G. Harding became an enigma. A man whose heart gave outer was taken from a life tangled in secrets and spun in smiles. His presidency ended in a hotel room, his legacy in a courtroom. And yet, for all his flaws, for all the failings of those around him, Harding's tragedy remains deeply human. Not in scandal, but in the shattering dissonance between public optimism and private collapse. And now, from secrets sealed behind hotel doors, we turn to a man who underwent a different kind of operation altogether. His tragedy wasn't in what he suffered, but in how he kept it hidden. His name was Grover Cleveland, and his secret surgery was just the beginning. Grover Cleveland. It was 1893, the beginning of a new term for Grover Cleveland, the only U.S. president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. He was back in the White House, a little older, a little grayer, with a mustache thick as a paintbrush and a face that gave away nothing. The country, meanwhile, was teetering. An economic panic had begun to tighten around the nation like a noose. Banks failed, railroads collapsed, the stock market spiraled. And then, as if that weren't enough, Grover Cleveland discovered he might be dying. The lump was inside his mouth, nestled on the roof of his mouth and hard as a pebble. It had been small at first, barely noticeable, but now it was growing. His doctors examined it in secret. Their diagnosis: cancer. More specifically, an epithelioma malignant, aggressive, and likely to spread. The public didn't know, and Cleveland was determined to keep it that way. The economy was already in chaos. Panic ran like fire across financial wires. The nation's confidence in its institutions was cracking. The last thing Cleveland wanted was a nation learning that their president might not survive the summer. So he hatched a plan. A surgery. In secret. On a boat. They called it the Oneida Yacht, owned by a close friend, Elias Benedict. The plan was audacious. While the press was told the president was going on a relaxing fishing trip, a team of 6 medical professionals chosen for their discretion and skill-boarded the yacht with surgical tools tucked into leather cases. July 1, 1893. The Oneida was moored in New York Harbor. The operating room was the yacht's main salon, its furniture cleared away and windows covered. There was no antiseptic, no antibiotics. Just whiskey, gauze, and steady hands. The president was strapped into a modified chair. Anesthesia was administered, delivered through a cone. The surgeons got to work. They cut into the roof of his mouth, removed part of his upper jaw, 5 teeth, and a tumor the size of a baseball. They did it all through the president's mouth, to avoid external scars. The operation took 90 minutes. Grover Cleveland never cried out, never flinched. He woke groggy, bandaged, missing part of his face. They anchored the yacht offshore for 5 days while he recovered. When they returned, the press was given a brief statement. The president had a minor dental issue, nothing to worry about. Just some toothache. It wasn't entirely a lie. But it wasn't the truth either. Recovery was brutal. Cleveland couldn't speak properly. He drooled. He lost weight. The pain was unrelenting. A prosthetic made of vulcanized rubber was created to fill the gap in his jaw. It was uncomfortable, but functional. With practice, he learned to talk again. Public appearances resumed. He was never photographed smiling during that time because he didn't want to, but because he physically couldn't. Still, he worked. Still, he led. All while concealing a disfigurement few could imagine. But secrets don't stay buried forever. In August 1893, a Philadelphia journalist named E.J. Edwards got wind of the surgery. He published the story in the Philadelphia Press, detailing the clandestine operation and casting doubt on the president's health. The White House denied everything, called the report false. Cleveland himself scoffed at the idea, and for decades the public believed him. Edwards' reputation was tarnished. The story was dismissed as sensationalism. The truth remained buried, just like the tumor. It wasn't until 1,979 years after Cleveland's death that the lead surgeon, Dr. Joseph Bryant, published an article confirming every detail: the surgery, the secrecy, the yacht. All of it true. Grover Cleveland had governed from the shadows of disfigurement, led a nation while part of his skull was missing. But that wasn't his only tragedy. Cleveland's personal life was a blend of late romance and early pressure. At age 49, he married 21-year-old Frances Folsom in the White House, the only president to marry during his term. She was poised, brilliant, and beloved by the public. They had 5 children, a bustling household, a rare flash of domestic joy in a role that so often devours it. But even their joy wasn't untouched by sorrow. Their daughter, Ruth, became a national darling. Her image was printed on candy wrappers and postcards. The Baby Ruth candy bar, though claimed to be named for baseball's Babe Ruth, was widely believed to have honored her. Then she died. In 1904, at the age of 12, from diphtheria, one of the most feared diseases of the time. No cure, no vaccine, just suffering. The nation mourned. Cleveland wept. Frances never fully recovered. And still, tragedy haunted the periphery of Cleveland's story. The public image was one of stability, stoicism, gravitas. But behind the scenes was a man often under siege not by political enemies, but by pain. Chronic gout plagued him in his later years. His legs swelled, his joints ached, he shuffled rather than walked. Some days he could barely get out of bed, yet he refused to retreat from public service. He wrote. He advised. He watched the Spanish-American War from the sidelines, heart heavy with regret. He died in 1908 at the age of 71. His final words: "I have tried so hard to do right." No monument marks the site of his secret surgery. The yacht is long gone. The tumor, preserved in a jar, disappeared into the archives of medical history. But the legacy remains. A president who concealed his own mortality to keep a nation from panicking. A man who lost a child, lost a piece of his face, and still stood before the country as its leader. Not for glory, for duty. Grover Cleveland's tragedy wasn't in how he suffered. It was in how he endured, invisibly. And from that hidden pain, we descend into the story of another Manone who faced heart attacks, strokes, and the tightening grip of his own mortality. His name was Dwight D. Eisenhower, and his heart nearly stopped the Cold War in its tracks. Dwight D. Eisenhower. He had already beaten the odds twice, really. First, by surviving World War II as Supreme Allied Commander, where millions died under his command but not by his hand. And second, by becoming President of the United States with no prior elected office. He was the 5-star general in a tailored suit. Ike, a symbol of calm in a world buzzing with Cold War dread and nuclear countdowns. But beneath the broad smile and calm demeanor, Dwight D. Eisenhower was a man being stalked by his own heart. The signs were there from the beginning. He smoked 4 packs of cigarettes a day for most of his adult life. Breakfasts were heavy on eggs and bacon, dinners full of red meat. He had the appetite of a soldier and the schedule of a commander. Rest wasn't an option. Relaxation was suspicious. Even his hobbies, bridge, golf, were strategic, calculated, never truly detached. And his heart began to pay the price. September 24, 1955. Eisenhower, then in the middle of his first term, was in Denver, Colorado. He had spent the day at Lowry Air Force Base and returned to his quarters at Fitzsimmons Army Hospitalis, standard stop for presidential checkups. That evening, he complained of chest pain. At first, he assumed it was indigestion. He'd eaten a hamburger late, but by nightfall, the pain had intensified. It radiated down his arm. He was short of breath, pale, sweating. Doctors rushed in. Diagnosis: myocardial infarction. A heart attack. Not mild, not fleeting, massive. The President of the United States was having a coronary event as the nuclear age teetered around him. He was immediately confined to bed. The White House scrambled to control the narrative. The press was told the president was indisposed. But within hours, the truth came out. America panicked. It was the height of the Cold War. The Soviets were testing hydrogen bombs. The arms race was in full swing. And now, the commander-in-chief was immobilized, his pulse thudding in a broken rhythm beneath an oxygen mask. There was no clear plan for what to do if the president became incapacitated. The 25th Amendment wouldn't exist for another decade. There was no legal mechanism to temporarily transfer power. Vice President Richard Nixon stood by, ready, but not officially empowered. Eisenhower, ever the general, made the call himself. He remained in charge. Even from his hospital bed, he read briefings, dictated memos, conferred with his cabinet, all while recovering from a condition that could have killed him in a single breath. He remained hospitalized for nearly 7 weeks. His recovery was slow. His gait changed. His appetite shrank. He lost weight. And he gave up cigarettes for good. He emerged from the hospital with a medical team's worth of advice, but the presidency didn't slow down. He returned to Washington, resumed work, gave press conferences with a raspy voice and a hand that trembled slightly. But the scares weren't over. In 1956, just months after reassuring the public of his recovery, Eisenhower suffered another heart event this time, diagnosed as ileitis, an inflammation of the small intestine. It required emergency surgery. His intestines were so damaged that surgeons removed over 10 inches. Another hospital stay. Another round of reassurances. Another wave of public anxiety. He smiled. He cracked jokes. But behind the scenes, his body was unraveling. Still, he ran for a second term. And won. But in 1957, during that second term, came another blow. A stroke. It happened while he was vacationing in Newport, Rhode Island. He was reading a newspaper, then suddenly couldn't form words. Aphasia, a short circuit in the brain's language center. For several agonizing hours, he was unable to speak clearly. The White House kept the press at bay. Again, doctors assured the public it was a minor cerebral incident. But in truth, it was a warning shot from his brain. The circuits were aging, the wires fraying. The man who had helped plan the invasion of Normandy now struggled to name objects in a room. He recovered, more or less. Speech returned. Coordination stabilized. But something was gone. Something in his posture. His spark. His presence seemed lighter, as if the body beneath the suit had grown hollowed out. And still, he served. He negotiated with Khrushchev, balanced budgets, took meetings, traveled. The world didn't stop because his arteries were narrowing. By the end of his presidency, in 1961, Eisenhower had suffered at least 7 known heart-related incidents. He had endured 3 serious illnesses during 2 terms, and never once relinquished power. He left office with his health visibly diminished, but with approval ratings higher than when he entered. Then he retired. First to Gettysburg, then to Walter Reed. His heart, which had carried him across continents and through presidencies, began to fail in earnest. From 1961 to 1969, he was in and out of hospitals almost constantly. Angina, arrhythmias, edema, kidney problems, congestive heart failure. Each time, the doctors stabilized him. Each time, he returned weaker. By 1969, his body was shutting down entirely. He died on March 28, 1969, at Walter Reed Medical Center. He was 78. Lyndon Johnson, himself a cardiac patient, ordered all flags at half-staff. Richard Nixon, his former vice president, delivered the eulogy. Millions watched. But in the hospital, in those final weeks, Eisenhower was asked how he wanted to be remembered. He said, "I want to be remembered as a man who had a job to do and did his best." Simple, stoic, exact. The tragedy of Dwight D. Eisenhower isn't that he died from heart disease. It's that his heart was always at war. He never stopped fighting enemies abroad, crises at home, and eventually, the slow betrayal of his own body. He smiled through the pain, governing from a hospital bed, reading war reports with a weakened pulse, dictating orders with hands that trembled from blood pressure swings. And he never let the world see him falter. But falter he did, repeatedly. He just did it quietly, like a general who knew the cost of showing weakness. And next, we turn from a general in a hospital to a farmer turned revolutionary whose final hours were spent gasping for air in his bedroom. His name was George Washington, and even in death, he obeyed the call of duty until his very last breath. George Washington. There was snow on the ground, not heavy, just enough to bite at the ankles, to whisper of winter's promise. It was December 12, 1799, and George Washington, retired general, first president of the United States, national icon, in a powdered wig, was out, riding through his estate at Mount Vernon, inspecting fences, checking on the horses. A routine trip. He'd done it 1,000 times before. The skies were gray, the air damp and cold. He stayed out for 5 hours. He came back soaked. He didn't change his clothes. There was dinner waiting, guests to attend to, papers to review. He waved off his valet's concern, said he wasn't chilled, sat down to eat with his wet breeches clinging to his skin. It would be his last supper. By the next morning, Washington had a sore throat. By the following night, he would be dead. But death, for George Washington, wasn't a simple process. It was theatrical, brutal, medieval. The kind of death you wouldn't expect for the most powerful man in America. That sore throat? It was acute epiglottitis and inflammation of the upper airway, a rare and deadly condition even today, when caught late. But in 1799, it was a sentence. Washington began to struggle with breathing, swallowing, speaking. His voice, usually commanding, faded to a hoarse whisper. He couldn't lie down without choking. And so began the bleeding. In those days, medicine meant purging the body of its ailments literally. Doctors arrived and immediately applied leeches. Then they made incisions in his arms and drained his blood, 4 times in 12 hours. They took 5 pints, nearly 40% of the blood in his body. He was suffocating, and bleeding, and freezing. He could barely whisper, but when he could, he did so with order, dignity. He thanked his doctors, asked that his affairs be settled, said he was not afraid to die, requested burial arrangements, down to the position of his body and the time his coffin should remain sealed 3 days, to avoid any accidental premature burial. It was a death curated with as much detail as his military campaigns. On December 14, 1799, sometime between 10 and 11 p.m., George Washington stopped breathing. He was 67 years old. His wife, Martha, stood silently by the bed, stoic. She didn't cry. She simply said, "'Tis well. All is now over. I shall soon follow him." She would live for 2 more years. The reaction to Washington's death was seismic. News took time in 1799, but when it arrived, it spread like wildfire. Bells tolled. Cities draped themselves in black. Memorial services erupted in every corner of the fledgling nation. Eulogies painted him as a modern-day Cincinnatus, the Roman general, who gave up power and returned to his plow. But underneath the marble and myth was a man who had lived with pain, not just in his final days. For decades, Washington had suffered from chronic illnesses throughout his life: malaria, dysentery, smallpox, severe tooth infections. He lost nearly all of his teeth before becoming president. By the time he was inaugurated in 1789, he had only 1 natural tooth remaining. He wore painful dentures made of ivory, metal, and in some cases, human teeth. They clicked when he spoke, rubbed his gums raw, twisted his jaw. And still, he stood for hours, delivered speeches, greeted crowds. He never let the pain show. Then there was the violence. He had survived countless near-death experiences. As a young officer in the French and Indian War, he had 2 horses shot out from under him. His coat was pierced by musket balls. At Braddock's disastrous defeat, he rode across a battlefield drenched in British and native blood, rallying terrified troops, guiding survivors out of ambush. He was 23 years old. Later, in the Revolution, he nearly froze to death alongside his men at Valley Forge. He crossed icy rivers in the dark, gambled everything on ragtag militia, marched through swamps, rain, defeat. He bled for a country that barely existed. And when victory came, when the war ended, when the adulation poured in, he walked away. Voluntarily. Twice. First after the war, then after the presidency. He could have been king, crowned by the people, installed by popularity. Instead, he retired, went home, became a farmer again. He didn't want statues. He wanted peace. But peace never quite came. In retirement, Washington struggled with the same challenges as any landowner of the time: debts, crop failures, tenant disputes. His health declined. The estate required constant management. His correspondence ballooned. Letters arrived by the hundreds, from admirers, critics, beggars, dignitaries. He tried to answer each one. The burdens of a nation still rested on his shoulders. Even in his sleep, he ground his teeth. His writing hand trembled. His memory faltered. But he never stopped serving. In 1798, just a year before his death, President John Adams asked him to come out of retirement once again, this time to lead the U.S. Army in case of war with France. Washington, now nearly 70, agreed. He knew he'd never wear the uniform again, but he accepted the position. Because duty, for him, didn't end with titles. It ended with breath. When he died, it wasn't just the end of a man. It was the end of a certainty. Washington had been the glue that held the American experiment together in its infancy. He had been above party, above scandal, above ambition. His absence left a vacuum politically, emotionally, culturally. A young nation suddenly felt older. His funeral was small, private. He had requested no elaborate displays, just quiet ceremony at Mount Vernon, a modest vault, a plain tomb. But the world didn't listen. Memorials erupted across the globe. Napoleon ordered a 10-day mourning period in France. In England, Parliament observed a moment of silence. In the United States, Washington's name became immortal. But the myth blurred the man. The real George Washington was not marble. He was flesh. He was a man who wept in battle, who wrote long letters of affection to friends, who loved his dogs, who danced when no one expected it, who laughed hard, who gave more than he ever took, and who died in agony gasping for air in his bedroom while doctors bled him dry with 18th century ignorance. His tragedy wasn't just in how he died. It was in how preventable it was. A modern antibiotic could have saved him. A tracheotomy then considered dangerous and experimental could have opened his airway and let him breathe. Instead, they bled him. Because that's what medicine believed. And so the father of his country died not in battle, not from age, but from the very hands meant to save him. But he never cried out. He never begged. He died like he lived stoic, prepared, and above all, thinking not of himself but of the legacy he would leave behind. A republic. A model of leadership. A myth that, for better or worse, outgrew the man who inspired it. Franklin Pierce. It happened in seconds. January 6, 1853. Franklin Pierce, President-elect of the United States, was on a train heading north through Massachusetts with his wife Jane and their only surviving son Benjamin. The train was new, fast, a symbol of American innovation. The Pierce family had boarded it just minutes before, fresh off the energy of a New Year's visit in Andover. And then, a screech. A snap. The axles gave way. The train jumped the rails. The passenger cars derailed and slammed into an embankment near Lawrence, shattering windows, buckling wood, twisting metal. People were thrown like rag dolls. Luggage scattered. Screams filled the snow-choked air. Franklin Pierce pulled himself from the wreckage, bloodied but conscious. Jane was shaken, her eyes wide with blank terror. Then they looked around. Their son 11-year-old Benjamin was nowhere to be seen. They found him moments later, still in his seat, crushed beneath a pile of splintered timber. His skull had been split. He died instantly. Franklin Pierce didn't cry. He froze. Jane screamed. And then she stopped, collapsed into herself, into silence. She would barely speak again for weeks. The man who had just been elected to lead the country now stood on the side of a frozen hill in Massachusetts, cradling the limp, broken body of his last child. He was about to become President of the United States, and he had just lost everything. Franklin and Jane Pierce had already buried 2 sons. Their firstborn, Franklin Jr., died in infancy, Their second, Frank Robert, died of typhus at age 4. But Benjamin Benny was different. He was the quiet one, studious, sweet-faced, often described as delicate, both in spirit and in body. He was Jane's anchor, her reason for enduring Washington's harsh spotlight, which she despised. She had begged Pierce not to run for president, had written letters to friends saying the presidency was a curse, that power invited misfortune, that God would not allow it without a cost. The train wreck felt, to her, like divine punishment. She believed God had taken Benny to keep Franklin humble, or to punish them both for seeking the White House. Pierce tried to carry on. He had to. The inauguration was scheduled for March. He gave up drinking during that time, a rare period of abstinence for a man known even then for his deep relationship with the bottle. On Inauguration Day, it rained. Hard. The skies opened over Washington, the clouds gray and unrelenting. Jane refused to attend. She remained upstairs in a room of mourning black. Franklin stood on the east portico of the Capitol, bareheaded, coatless, soaked through. He delivered his entire address from memory. No notes, no teleprompter. His voice rang out like a cracked bell. He never mentioned Benjamin by name, but every word was saturated in grief. He spoke of trials, of the burdens of office, of being tested. He would be. Jane went into mourning for nearly the entirety of his presidency. She rarely left the White House, wrote letters to her dead son, believed she could still hear his voice in the walls. Her mental health deteriorated. She kept rooms dark, draped portraits in black, held seances, prayed daily that she might die soon and be reunited with her boys. Pierce, meanwhile, governed a nation fracturing at the seams while holding together a marriage that had shattered. Every morning, he walked alone through the White House. Every night, he returned to a bedroom chilled by silence. He aged rapidly. Lines etched deep into his once youthful face. His hair, black and full, began to gray. He was 48 when he took office, the youngest president to that point. He looked 60 by the time he left. He began drinking again, quietly at first, then constantly. After his presidency ended in 1857, Pierce left Washington. He never held office again, declined public roles, refused to speak out on national issues, even as the country spiraled towards civil war. He wrote letters, traveled, drifted, haunted by loss. He had outlived all 3 of his children, and as the years passed, he would lose more. Jane died in 1863 from tuberculosis. She was 57. Pierce was with her at the end. She had spent the last years of her life cloaked in grief, writing long spiritual letters, speaking little to anyone but the dead. After her death, Pierce descended fully into isolation. He moved between hotels and rental homes in New England, rarely stayed long in any one place. Old friends visited him, but he kept his distance. The bottle, however, stayed close. In public, he maintained a gentleman's manner, courteous, composed. In private, he unraveled. His letters from this period are erratic, sentimental, tinged with melancholy and desperation. He wrote long passages about Benny, about Jane, about how time couldn't dull pain, only smooth its edges. He stopped attending public events. His health declined. By 1869, he was suffering from cirrhosis of the liver. He began to vomit blood. His weight dropped. He could barely walk without assistance. One of his final acts was to request that his private papers be destroyed upon his death. They were. On October 8, 1869, Franklin Pierce died alone in his home in Concord, New Hampshire. He was 64 years old. No grand funeral. No national mourning. just a slow fade into obscurity. History didn't know what to do with him, a man marked more by tragedy than triumph. But his story didn't disappear. It stayed tucked in the margins, in letters yellowed with time, in photographs where his smile never quite reached his eyes, in the ghost of a boy on a train. James K. Polk. He had been president for exactly 4 years. No more, no less. Not a day extra. James K. Polk kept his promise. Serve 1 term, get things done, and go home. And he did. He checked the boxes, expanded the map, filled the headlines, and then walked out of Washington with the kind of orderly precision he'd brought to every chapter of his life. He left the presidency on March 4, 1849. He was dead by June 15. 103 days later. It remains the shortest post-presidency in American history. A man who had risen to the pinnacle of power, who had expanded the nation's borders by 1/3, who had governed with relentless energy gone in a flash. Not from bullets, not from scandal, but from something far crueler, the slow toll of ambition on a body already fraying at the edges. James Knox Polk was born in 1795 in North Carolina, sickly from the start. By age 17, his body was already betraying him. He suffered from intense abdominal pain, frequent vomiting, weight loss, the culprit, bladder stones. At 17, Polk underwent a gruesome surgery without anesthesia. It was 1812. There was no chloroform, no ether, just whiskey, a knife, and grit. The surgeon made an incision through the perineum between the scrotum and rectum, cut through muscle, and pulled the stones out. The pain was excruciating, the infection risk astronomical. Somehow, Polk survived. But the surgery likely left him sterile. He and his wife, Sarah Childress Polk, would never have children. He entered adulthood with a body altered and a temperament sharpened by pain. Ambition filled the void. He became a lawyer, a congressman, then Speaker of the House, then Governor of Tennessee. He was methodical, tireless, humorless. A man who studied for hours, wrote endlessly, planned each move like a game of chess. He was known as Young Hickory, a nod to his idol, Andrew Jackson, Old Hickory himself. And in 1844, Polk made the leap of a lifetime. The Democratic Party was split. Polk wasn't the favorite. He wasn't even a top contender. But in a stunning twist at the convention, he emerged as a dark horse candidate, the first in American history to win the presidency from near anonymity. He campaigned on expansion, manifest destiny, and he delivered. In 4 years, Polk annexed Texas, negotiated Oregon, won the Mexican-American War, and acquired California and the entire Southwest. He fulfilled every campaign promise, but at a cost. He worked relentlessly. 12-hour days, 7 days a week. He micromanaged every detail, read every letter, edited every speech, reviewed even the punctuation in legislation. He dismissed leisure as wasteful, rest as indulgence. His body protested. His eyes dimmed. His skin grew pale. He developed chronic diarrhea, indigestion, migraines. His once thick hair began to fall out. He grew gaunt, hollowed. But he kept going. Because for Polk, the presidency wasn't about pageantry. It was war. Against inefficiency, against half measures, against time. When he left office in March 1849, he did so triumphantly but broken. He and Sarah set out on a long southern tour, a victory lap of sorts, from Washington to North Carolina, through the Carolinas and Georgia, down to New Orleans. Crowds greeted them at every stop. Bands played. Fireworks exploded. It was meant to be celebratory. But along the way, Polk fell ill. Doctors called it cholera morbus, an ambiguous term in the 19th century that could mean anything from food poisoning to full-blown cholera. It began with fever, then vomiting, then relentless diarrhea. His weight plummeted. His pulse weakened. He could barely stand. When they reached Nashville, Tennessee, in early June, he was already fading. Doctors tried bleeding him, purging him, feeding him castor oil. Nothing worked. Sarah sat by his side, reading to him from scripture, holding his hand. He slipped in and out of consciousness. On June 15, 1849, James K. Polk died. He was 53 years old. And just like that, the man who had orchestrated the most aggressive territorial expansion in U.S. history was gone barely out of the White House. He had no funeral procession befitting a president. No elaborate state ceremonies. Just a quiet burial in Nashville. Later, his body was moved twice once to a tomb at the Tennessee State Capitol, where it rests today. But his legacy and his tragedy were already sealed. James K. Polk had burned too hot. He had governed like a man on borrowed time. And maybe he was. His letters in the final months show a man obsessed with purpose. He cataloged his achievements, justified his decisions, wrote to old enemies with icy civility. He wanted history to understand, to remember, but history barely noticed. Polk was forgotten almost as quickly as he had risen. He had no children to carry his name, no memoirs to shape his narrative. His wife, Sarah, lived another 42 years. She never remarried, wore black every day, kept his papers locked away, kept his house as it had been. Each morning, she set a place for him at the table. Grief, like ambition, was her discipline. The doctors never agreed on what exactly killed him. Cholera, dysentery, possibly both. But the truth was simpler. He was exhausted. His body had been slowly crumbling under the weight of responsibility. He had spent everything: energy, time, blood, focus in serving a nation. He had no strength left for himself. James K. Polk's tragedy was not that he died young. It's that he knew he would. He said it once, near the end of his term. No president who performs his duties faithfully and conscientiously can have any leisure. He was right. And it killed him. Andrew Johnson. The funeral train had not yet arrived in Washington when the silence began to spread. Abraham Lincoln was dead. The city that had just tasted the sweetness of victory's Civil War concluded, Union Preserve now choked on the smoke of assassination. Inside the White House, curtains were drawn, mirrors shrouded in black, and in a quiet upstairs chamber of the Kirkwood House Hotel, a man was being roused from a drunken stupor. His name was Andrew Johnson, and in a matter of hours, he would become President of the United States. The morning of April 15, 1865, dawned not with celebration, but confusion. Johnson had been Lincoln's vice president for only 6 weeks. He had taken the oath of office in a Senate chamber, thick with awkward glances and muffled whispers. He had slurred his way through a speech just days before at his own swearing in, allegedly intoxicated, rambling about his own rise from poverty. The newspapers had roasted him. Colleagues cringed. And now, he stood one heartbeat away from the presidency. And the heartbeat had stopped. Abraham Lincoln was dead, shot in the back of the head. Johnson was sworn in that same day, in a private ceremony, grim-faced and unsteady. Witnesses described him as pale, distraught, but sober. He took the oath with trembling hands and inherited a nation on fire. But long before Johnson became the most accidental of presidents, he had already lived a life that read more like a Gothic novel than a political resume. Born in 1808 in a log cabin in Raleigh, North Carolina, Johnson was raised in grinding poverty. His father, a hotel janitor, died when Andrew was just 3 years old, leaving the family destitute. His mother took in laundry to survive. There was no money for school. Johnson never received a formal education. Not one day. At age 10, he was apprenticed to a tailor. At age 15, he ran away. He and his brother fled town under cover of night, pursued by their employer for breach of contract. They moved to Tennessee, bouncing between towns. Johnson taught himself to read by candlelight. He studied speeches, newspapers, and the U.S. Constitution. He married Eliza McCardle, a schoolteacher, who helped him refine his reading and writing. He rose from tailor to town alderman, to mayor, to state legislator, to congressman. Every rung of the ladder was climbed with bloodied hands and dogged willpower. He was proud, prickly, suspicious of elites, a man who came from nothing and never let anyone forget it. But with pride came wounds. His personal life was riddled with sickness and grief. He and Eliza had 5 children. Their daughter Mary died young. Their son Charles, a doctor, developed a drinking problem and died after falling from a horse. Their second son, Robert, became an alcoholic and was institutionalized. Another son, Andrew Jr., died of tuberculosis. By the time Johnson became president, only one of his children remained stable. The White House, once a symbol of grandeur, became a haunted space. Eliza, sickly and reclusive, rarely appeared in public. She suffered from tuberculosis and rarely left her quarters. She watched from windows, delegated hostess duties to her daughter. Her health grew worse by the day. Johnson himself never stopped carrying the weight of poverty, of shame, of being seen as lesser. He carried it into every meeting, every confrontation. His temper was volcanic. His speeches, often defensive and bitter, alienated allies. His enemies multiplied. But the tragedy of Andrew Johnson isn't just political, it's personal. He had fought his whole life to rise above obscurity. And when he reached the pinnacle, when the weight of the country rested in his hands, it crushed him. He left office isolated, shunned, with no party to call home, no allies in the capital, no parade, no farewell. He went back to Tennessee, where he tried to find peace on familiar ground. He opened a law office, tried to repair his name, but the ghosts followed him. In 1875, nearly a decade after leaving the White House, Johnson staged a political comeback. He won election to the U.S. Senate. It was the first time in history that a former president had returned to the Senate. Johnson arrived in Washington defiant, his old seat, his old fury. He delivered a speech in March of that year, his final act in public life. 4 months later, on July 31, 1875, he suffered a stroke while visiting his daughter. He died the next day. There was no grand procession, no national mourning, just a worn man buried under a plain stone slab in Greenville, Tennessee. He requested a copy of the U.S. Constitution be buried with him. His body was wrapped in an American flag. His epitaph, his faith in the people never wavered. But if faith was his weapon, tragedy was his shadow. Andrew Johnson lived through poverty, lost children to illness and addiction, buried a wife whose lungs gave out, and carried the burden of a nation's chaos on shoulders that had never known rest. He died as he had lived misunderstood. Richard Nixon. The lights were already dimmed when the plane touched down in California, April 22, 1994. The skies above Yorba Linda were a bruised gray. Rain tapped lightly against the limousine windows as the motorcade pulled into the familiar driveway. At the head of the column, a simple hearse. Inside, the body of Richard Milhous Nixon, 37th President of the United States. It was the end of a journey so long, so jagged, so saturated with tension that no single line could explain it. He was many things: brilliant, bitter, bulldog, pariah. But most of all, Richard Nixon was a man who carried grief like armor, who buried trauma under ambition, wore his scars as strategy, and died, finally, with his heart giving out before he ever truly let go. His was a life of chronic loss. And the first one came early. He was born in 1913 in Yorba Linda, California, the second of 5 boys. His father, Frank, was a stern Quaker with a volatile temper. His mother, Hannah, quiet and devout. The Nixon household was modest gas lamps, hand-me-down clothes, and the constant churn of illness. Tragedy hovered like smoke. First came Harold, the oldest Nixon boy, the golden child. Handsome, charming, athletic. Richard idolized him. But Harold fell ill in his late teens, tuberculosis, the scourge of the age. The family moved to Arizona, hoping the dry air might cure him. It didn't. Richard stayed behind to keep the family store running. His teenage years were spent stocking shelves, balancing books, watching his brother waste away from afar. Harold died in 1933. He was just 23. Nixon was 20. He never forgot the sound of the telegram arriving, or the way his mother didn't cry, just went quiet for days. Then came Arthur, another brother. This one died even younger from encephalitis at just 7 years old. Nixon was 9 at the time, old enough to remember the fevers, the seizures, the screams, and then the silence. Richard learned early that people you love can vanish in a night, and that the world does not wait for your mourning. He internalized it, built walls, studied obsessively, pushed down every feeling not useful to his ambition. And ambition, for Nixon, became the substitute for peace. He went to Whittier College, then Duke Law School. Married Pat Ryan, he's rock, his match, his firebrand. They had 2 daughters, Julie and Tricia. He served in World War II, then ran for Congress, then Senate, then Vice President under Eisenhower. Each rung on the ladder cost him something. Each win left a bruise. But he kept climbing. Then came 1960. He ran for president against John F. Kennedy, lost by the thinnest of margins. A razor's edge. Television showed him sweating, grimacing. America watched him lose in real time. It wasn't just a political defeat. It was a personal humiliation. He called it his last press conference. Vowed to quit politics. But he didn't. Because Nixon never quit. He ran again in 1968. And this time, he won. But tragedy didn't respect power. It didn't care about the Oval Office. As president, Nixon was haunted by the past. Not just politically, but physically. His health declined. He suffered from phlebitis, deep vein thrombosis. His body swelled. His face reddened. He developed insomnia, drank heavily, took sleeping pills, painkillers. The presidency weighed on him like a stone pressing into the chest. Pat Nixon, once vibrant and sharp-tongued, began to fade too. She developed emphysema and lung cancer, a consequence of decades of smoking. But she did it quietly, like she did everything. Nixon watched her deteriorate from the shadows. When she died in 1993, he didn't weep publicly. He stood at her grave and said, "She was a spirit of courage." Then he turned and walked away. The grief aged him by years in weeks. His final months were spent mostly alone in his New Jersey home. His daughters visited, old friends called, but something had left him. He suffered a severe stroke on April 18, 1994, collapsed in his bathroom. The doctors said he had a massive cerebral hemorrhage, paralyzed on his right side. He never regained consciousness. 4 days later, he died. He was 81. No final words. Just a long exhale. The press described it as a peaceful death. But Nixon never died peacefully. Not really. Because for all the noise that followed his name, for all the scandals, the speeches, the history books, his life was defined not by power, but by loss. Loss of brothers. Loss of childhood. Loss of reputation. Loss of peace. The man who once said, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore," had spent his entire life kicking himself harder than anyone else could. He was not a man who allowed himself grief. He weaponized it, and it cost him nearly everything. His tragedy was not a single moment. It was cumulative, stacked like bricks, each one heavier than the last. And when the wall finally gave, it didn't collapse. It cracked quietly, like a man alone in a hospital room, holding on to breath until there was nothing left to prove. Gerald Ford. It begins not with a bang, but with a phone call. August 8, 1974. Richard Nixon, cloaked in disgrace, picks up the receiver and tells Gerald Ford he's resigning. The voice is distant. Ford nods. He hangs up. Then he walks to a mirror in his study, looks at his own face, and says out loud, "God help me." The next day, he takes the oath of office. And just like that, Gerald Rudolph Ford Jr., a man who never campaigned for the presidency, who never even imagined it, becomes the 38th president of the United States. But the seeds of Ford's tragedy had been planted long before that oath, long before Washington, long before politics. They started with abandonment. He was born Leslie Lynch King Jr. in Omaha, Nebraska, in 1913. His father was a violent man, abusive, quick-tempered, and dangerous. Just weeks after Ford was born, his mother, Dorothy, grabbed her newborn son, fled the house, and left her husband forever. They moved to Grand Rapids, Michigan. There, she remarried. Her new husband, Gerald Rudolph Ford, a kind-hearted paint salesman, adopted the boy and gave him his name. Gerald Ford never legally changed his name. He just became it. He never saw his biological father again until he was 16. The reunion was brief, awkward, chilly. Ford later described it as one of the most uncomfortable moments of his life. His birth father made no apologies, offered no warmth, gave him $25 and disappeared again. It scarred him. Not visibly, but deeply. Gerald Ford grew up with a permanent chip on his shoulder. He became an Eagle Scout, a football captain, a college star. He played center and linebacker at the University of Michigan. When his team went undefeated, he was the anchor. He turned down offers from the Green Bay Packers and Detroit Lions to study law at Yale. From there, it was a straight line into the Navy, into public service, and eventually into Congress. But nothing in his life prepared him for the presidency. He had always been the team player, not the quarterback. The loyal foot soldier, not the general. When Spiro Agnew resigned as vice president in disgrace in 1973, Nixon appointed Ford to replace him, not because he was ambitious, but because he was trusted. A man without enemies. A placeholder. Then came Watergate. And suddenly, the placeholder became the president. It was the only time in American history that both the presidency and the vice presidency were held by men never elected to either office. Ford stepped into the role with quiet resolve. But the nation didn't give him a honeymoon. 31 days into his presidency, he issued a full pardon to Richard Nixon. He said it was for the healing of the country. He said it was to move forward, but the backlash was instant. People accused him of cutting a deal, of betrayal, of complicity. Approval ratings plummeted. Protesters appeared outside the White House gates with signs that read, "Traitor." And Ford carried it all with his trademark calm. But underneath the calm was a man unraveling. He barely slept. He lost weight. His wife, Betty, was also beginning to struggle. Within a year of his presidency, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. A double mastectomy followed. Her recovery was harrowing, public, and, at the time, revolutionary. She spoke about her illness openly, candidly, an act of transparency unheard of for a first lady. But her own battles weren't limited to cancer. Betty Ford was quietly addicted to alcohol and painkillers. She would later say she drank to fill the emptiness of White House isolation. Ford knew, but at the time, the country didn't. He bore that weight too. In 1975, Ford survived 2 assassination attempts, both within 3 weeks. First in Sacramento, then in San Francisco. Both women. Both obsessed, unstable, and armed. The Secret Service tackled one before she could fire. The other squeezed off a shot that narrowly missed. Ford kept moving, kept smiling. But the world was shifting beneath his feet. The economy was collapsing. Inflation soaring. Unemployment climbing. Every decision he made was second-guessed. And yet, he endured. He fell, literally, multiple times, including famously on the steps of Air Force One. The press had a field day. They turned him into a punchline. SNL, then still in its infancy, crafted entire sketches around his clumsiness. Chevy Chase tripped and stumbled and crashed into sets week after week, reducing the president to a walking pratfall. The image stuck, but it was never true. Gerald Ford was an athlete, a precision thinker, a chess player, and the man who steered America out of one of its darkest hours with steadiness and calm. But history didn't reward him for that. In 1976, he ran for election and lost. Barely. By fewer than 2 percentage points. To Jimmy Carter. The concession was gracious, but the hurt ran deep. He returned to private life, to Grand Rapids, to golf and lectures and quiet mornings, but he never stopped wondering what if. What if he hadn't pardoned Nixon? What if he just waited? What if he'd run harder? Sooner? His children say he never voiced regret, but the burden never left him. His marriage endured. Betty went to rehab in 1978. She recovered. And then, in one of the most remarkable second acts in American history, she helped others recover too. She founded the Betty Ford Center. And Gerald was right there supporting her, encouraging her, attending events with her. Always the quiet one in the back of the room, holding her purse, whispering her name with a smile. He lived long. Longer than any other U.S. president at the time. He died at 93. December 26, 2006. At his side was his family. On the table beside him, a stack of newspapers, a crossword puzzle, and a copy of the Federalist Papers. He was buried in Grand Rapids, next to Betty. And while he may never have been the loudest voice or the most dramatic story, his life was a slow, burning tragedy of a different kind. A man who did the right thing and was punished for it. A man who held the country's broken pieces together, only to be forgotten when it was whole again. His tragedy was not in scandal, not in suffering, but in silence. And now, from a man who inherited the shrapnel of another's fall, we turn to a president who never made it out of the shadows of grief. A man whose presidency was barely born when it was shot through the heart. His name was William McKinley, and his tragedy was a bullet wrapped in a handshake. William McKinley. It was a handshake that ended a presidency, a gesture of trust, of openness. September 6, 1901. The Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. President William McKinley stood inside the Temple of Music, greeting a long line of citizens. His coat was freshly pressed, his smile steady. His right hand extended to every man, woman, and child who passed. Then came a man with his hand wrapped in a white cloth. Inside the cloth, a .32 caliber revolver. He fired twice. The first bullet grazed McKinley's chest. The second tore through his abdomen, shredded his stomach lining, and lodged somewhere behind his pancreas. He staggered back, slumped. Security swarmed the shooter-an anarchist named Leon Czolgosz, but McKinley waved them off. "Let no one hurt him," he said. Those were his first words. And the beginning of the end? But long before that day in Buffalo, McKinley's life had already been steeped in pain. He was born in 1843 in Niles, Ohio, the seventh of 9 children. His parents, devout Methodists, raised him on discipline and duty. He was quiet, polite, hardworking. At 18, he enlisted in the Union Army during the Civil War. He served with distinction at Antietam and several major battles, rising to the rank of brevet major. But the scars of war followed him. He witnessed death up close, friends blown apart, young men sobbing into the earth. He emerged intact, but changed. His faith in honor and country intensified, and so did his resolve to serve. He studied law, entered politics, and married Ida Saxton, a refined banker's daughter with sharp intelligence and a quick wit. They seemed a perfect match. But the tragedies began soon after. Their first daughter, Catherine, was born in 1871. Their second, Ida, in 1873. Little Ida died that same year. Then, less than 2 years later, Catherine Katy fell ill with typhoid fever. She died in 1875, just shy of her 4th birthday. Ida never recovered. She descended into grief like a stone into a well. She suffered from epilepsy, then known only as nervous fits and depression. She became reclusive, ill in a fragile, often bedridden. At public events, she was barely present. McKinley began positioning her chair so that, if she seized, he could discreetly cover her face with a handkerchief and continue with the event. He loved her fiercely. Never once considered divorce. Never once took another companion. He built his schedule around her. She attended cabinet meetings, state dinners, in silence, wrapped in shawls, eyes vacant. He called her my beautiful invalid. And through it all, he kept climbing. Congressman, Governor of Ohio, President. He was elected in 1896 and re-elected in 1900. His presidency was marked by war, prosperity, and a rising American empire. But none of it dulled the ache at home. Every night, he returned to a woman, lost in mourning. His letters to her were short but tender, always signed, "Yours, devotedly, William." Then came Buffalo. The fair was meant to be a celebration of American progress, electricity, invention, industry. McKinley was at the height of his popularity. The crowds adored him. And that's where it ended. After being shot, he was rushed to the fair's makeshift hospital. There were no modern surgical tools, no antiseptics, no x-rays. The doctors did what they could. One used his finger to trace the path of the bullet. They closed the wound, declared it stable. For a few days, McKinley improved. He sat up, ate toast, whispered to Ida that he would recover. "It is God's way," he said. "His will, not ours, be done." But infection was already spreading. The bullet was still inside. And by the 7th day, his body began to shut down. His skin turned yellow. His breath came in rattles. He slipped into a coma. On September 14, 1901, at 2:15 a.m., William McKinley died. He was 58 years old. Ida was not present when he passed. She arrived minutes later, stood beside his body, touched his face, said nothing. The nation was stunned. Another president assassinated. The third in under 40 years. Lincoln, Garfield, now McKinley. But his was the quietest tragedy. No civil war, no courtroom drama, just a quiet, devoted man wounded by war, hollowed by grief, and felled by a stranger's bullet in the middle of a handshake. At his funeral in Canton, Ohio, mourners lined the streets. Schools closed, businesses shuttered. A band played "Nearer, My God, to Thee," his favorite hymn. His body was buried in a mausoleum on a hill overlooking the city. Ida followed him in death just 6 years later. She was laid beside him. The bullet that killed him was never found. But the damage was done. Not just to his body, but to the last traces of 19th century optimism. McKinley's presidency had represented calm, control, stability. His death marked the end of that illusion. And from the man who died with a prayer on his lips and grief in his heart, we turn now to a president whose personal sorrows ran far deeper than the headlines ever showed. His name was Ronald Reagan, and his tragedy unfolded not in a moment of violence, but in the slow, unrelenting erosion of memory. Ronald Reagan. It started with small things. Misplaced names, missed cues, a forgotten appointment here, a repeated anecdote there. Nothing unusual at first. He was in his 80s, after all. Age made room for forgetfulness. People laughed it off. Even he did. But behind the jokes, behind the glint of Hollywood charm and presidential polish, something darker was brewing. Something irreversible. Ronald Reagan was forgetting himself. He was born in 1911 in a small apartment above a storefront in Tampico, Illinois, the second son of a working-class Irish-American family. His father, Jack Reagan, was a shoe salesman with a drinking problem. His mother, Nell, was devout, optimistic, and the axis on which the family spun. From her, young Ronald inherited a sense of resilience. From his father, a sense of the damage a man can cause when his demons go unchecked. Reagan grew up poor, often on the move. The family bounced from town to town, renting rooms, scraping by. He worked lifeguard shifts in the summer, over 70 lives saved by the time he left high school, or so he claimed. His early years were steeped in a relentless need to prove that optimism could beat reality into submission. He became a radio announcer, then an actor, then a war correspondent, then a television host. The smile never left his face. The lines between persona and person blurred until no one could tell where Ronald Reagan ended and the performance began. In 1940, he married actress Jane Wyman. They had 2 children, Maureen and an adopted son, Michael. The marriage fell apart in 1949, his only divorce. He rarely spoke about it afterward. Then came Nancy Davis. She was younger, sharper, fiercely loyal. They married in 1952 and had 2 more children, Patty and Ron Jr. Nancy was not just a wife. She was an anchor, a compass, a gatekeeper. She sensed when he was slipping long before anyone else did. His political life was seismic. 2-term governor, 2-term president. But the most haunting chapter of Ronald Reagan's life began after the cameras stopped rolling. January 20, 1989, he left the White House waving. The nation smiled with him. But behind closed doors, the smile began to fade. In 1994, 5 years after his presidency, Reagan wrote a letter to the American people. I have recently been told that I am one of the millions of Americans who will be afflicted with Alzheimer's disease, it read. I now begin the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life. It was a rare act of public vulnerability. No jokes, no polish, just a man looking into the void. The disease didn't come like lightning. It crept like fog. He began forgetting names, misplacing objects, repeating stories within minutes of telling them. His sentences shortened, his focus dimmed. The man who once commanded stages with a memory for speeches and scripts now paused mid-sentence, confused by his own thoughts. He withdrew from public life. Nancy became his protector. She stopped visitors who might upset him, curated his schedule, controlled what he saw, heard, even read. As his world shrank, hers became one of quiet devastation. Ronnie doesn't know my name anymore, she told friends in the early 2000s. But he still smiles when I walk into the room. That was enough for a time. In the early stages, Reagan would walk the grounds of their Bel Air home. He talked to portraits, stared at the walls. He would ask staff members, "Where's my office?" Or, "Is it time for lunch yet?" Even if he'd just eaten. By the late 1990s, he no longer recognized the house he had lived in for over a decade. His children each handled it differently. Maureen, his eldest, was his fiercest defender. But she herself was dying from melanoma. She passed away in 2001. Nancy sat beside her coffin and wept. Reagan, barely aware, sat beside her in a daze. Patty, his youngest daughter, had long battled with him ideologically, emotionally, publicly, but even she softened in those years. He doesn't know who I am, she wrote, but I still love the man I see. Ron Jr., the ballet-dancing, free-thinking son, visited often. Sometimes Reagan recognized him. Sometimes he didn't. Time blurred. By 2003, he could no longer speak in full sentences. By 2004, he couldn't speak at all. His hands trembled. His body thinned. His once towering frame, over 6 feet tall, curled into itself. He spent most of his days in bed or in a chair by the window, watching light move across the wall. Nancy never left his side. She read to him, played him music Frank Sinatra, Glenn Miller. Sometimes he would smile, but mostly he stared. His final days were quiet. Doctors came and went. Aides kept their voices low. The Secret Service stood watch outside a house wrapped in silence. On June 5, 2004, Ronald Reagan died of pneumonia, a complication of Alzheimer's. He was 93. Nancy broke down. It was the long goodbye, she would later say. The funeral was grand. Dignitaries from around the world attended. Mourners lined the streets. Air Force One flew his casket home to California. There, beneath the setting sun at the Reagan Presidential Library, he was laid to rest. The inscription on his tomb reads, "I know in my heart that man is good, that what is right will always eventually triumph, and there is purpose and worth to each and every life." But Alzheimer's doesn't care about optimism. It stripped him of words, memory, identity. It reduced one of the most articulate public figures of the 20th century to silence. And the tragedy wasn't in how he died. It was in how long it took. How long he drifted lost in a fog of dying synapses and failing neurons unable to recognize his wife, his children, or himself. The man who once charmed entire nations with a smile couldn't remember how to tie his shoes. And yet, even at the end, there were moments. Brief flickers. A touch. A glance. A squeeze of Nancy's hand. Proof, however faint, that someone was still in there. Lyndon B. Johnson. The ranch was silent. Not just quiescent. That eerie, sprawling hush that blankets empty fields and echoes through mesquite trees. Lyndon Baines Johnson sat alone at his desk in the corner room of the Texas White House, a Marlboro burning low in one hand, a half-empty glass of Cutty Sark in the other. Outside, the sky over hill country had turned a flat, colorless gray. The Secret Service agents at the front gate shifted in their boots and said nothing. They'd seen the same scene play out day after day. A once titanic man dissolving before their eyes. Lyndon B. Johnson was dying, but he'd been dying for years. This is not just the story of a man succumbing to heart failure. It's the story of a man who spent a lifetime feeding on power, and once it was gone, found nothing left but ghosts. Johnson's tragedy didn't start in the Oval Office. It started in the dirt. He was born in 1908 in Stonewall, Texas, a hill town so remote it barely counted as a dot on the map. His family had once been powerful ranchers and politicians, but by the time Lyndon was a boy, they were broke. His father, a former legislator, had lost everything in bad land deals and spiraling debt. Lyndon watched his parents struggle to put food on the table. He wore shoes until the soles gave out, took hand-me-downs from cousins. His classmates mocked him for the holes in his clothes, and he never forgot it. Poverty became his shadow. It followed him through school, through college, through the corridors of Congress. He worked as a teacher in a tiny Mexican-American school in Cotulla, Texas, where the kids came to class barefoot. He saw the way poverty chained generations. And somewhere in that sweltering classroom, a mission was born. He would rise, and he would never be powerless again. Johnson climbed the political ladder like a man scaling a cliff in a thunderstorm fast, reckless, relentless. He entered Congress at 28, won a Senate seat in his 30s, and became the most powerful majority leader the chamber had ever seen. He could pass a bill in a day, twist arms in a hallway, drop a phone call at midnight that changed the vote count by breakfast. But power came at a cost. He worked 20-hour days, ate little, smoked constantly, and by 1955, at just 46 years old, Johnson had his first massive heart attack. It nearly killed him. Doctors ordered him to slow down. He didn't. He couldn't. Power was the only medicine that worked. He became vice president under John F. Kennedy in 1961, a job he hated. He was sidelined, ignored, kept at the kids' table. But then, on November 22, 1963, in the back seat of a car in Dallas, fate punched through the windshield. Kennedy was dead, and Johnson was president. He took the oath aboard Air Force One next to a blood-splattered Jackie Kennedy, and from that moment forward, his life was never quiet again. He passed legislation like a man on fire: the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, Medicare, Medicaid, education reform, housing, environmental laws. A whirlwind of social reform that reshaped the country. But behind the whirlwind, his body was breaking. He suffered angina, palpitations, fatigue so intense he sometimes fell asleep mid-conversation. He'd often lie on the floor during meetings, propped up on pillows, dictating memos to staffers while a doctor checked his pulse. By 1968, the stress had carved deep canyons in his face. His jowls sagged, his voice grew hoarse, his hands trembled. And still, he worked. Until he couldn't. March 31, 1968. Johnson shocked the nation by announcing he would not seek re-election. He was done, exhausted, finished with Washington. He returned to his ranch in Stonewall, and watched the country he once ruled from behind a desk now flicker past him on a television screen. He was 60, and he looked 80. At the ranch, he tried to find peace, tried to pretend there was still purpose. But power had been his oxygen. Without it, he suffocated. His health nosedived. He gained weight fast. He grew reclusive. Chain-smoked cigarettes despite the warnings, despite the heart surgeries, despite the doctor's pleas. He rarely left the house, rarely saw visitors. His hair, once slick and dark, turned thin and silver. His skin grew mottled and pale. His wife, Lady Bird, watched helplessly as the man she had known since college became a shadow pacing the halls. He built a theater on the ranch where he screened news footage of his presidency on repeat. Hours of himself giving speeches, signing bills, shaking hands. Over and over. He wasn't watching for nostalgia. He was studying what he had lost. In 1972, Johnson suffered a second heart attack, then a third, then multiple hospitalizations. Each time, he returned home weaker. His breathing labored, his chest burning. But he refused to quit smoking. And in the last year of his life, he began recording tapes audio diaries of his thoughts, his regrets, his rage. He knew the end was coming. And he wasn't ready. On January 22, 1973, just one day after Richard Nixon's second inauguration, Lyndon B. Johnson picked up the phone to call a Secret Service agent. His voice was faint. He said he couldn't breathe. Then he collapsed. The phone dangled from the cord. By the time help arrived, he was gone. A heart attack. Massive. Final. He was 64. His body was flown to Washington for a state funeral, then back to Texas for burial beneath the oaks of the family cemetery. Lady Bird stood at the grave, silent, flanked by her daughters. The wind blew softly across the tall grass. The cattle wandered the fields. And just like that, the ranch fell quiet again. But his story didn't vanish. It was too loud for that. Too full of contradictions. He had once said, "Every man has a right to a Saturday night bath." It was a joke, sure, but beneath the humor was a man who believed in dignity for others. He just never gave it to himself. His tragedy wasn't a moment. It was a slow corrosion. A man who gave everything, who accomplished more than most, but who could never escape the poverty of his childhood or the cost of the power he chased. He was haunted. By war. By legacy. By the image of a nation that cheered when he stepped down. And in the end, he didn't die in the arms of applause or acclaim. He died alone, clutching a phone, asking for breath that never came. James Buchanan. The shutters were always drawn. Even in the daylight, Wheatland, the sprawling red brick estate on the edge of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, seemed wrapped in twilight. The hedges were perfectly clipped. The hallways lined with portraits, clocks ticking like slow metronomes. It was the home of James Buchanan, 15th President of the United States, and it had become something of a mausoleum. Not just for his career, for his life. After the White House, Buchanan returned to Wheatland alone. No children, no wife, no staff beyond the handful of servants who had been with him since his diplomatic years. The silence of the place was a familiar comfort. He had lived in solitude for decades, but as the nation exploded in war and grief, the walls of his home seemed to close in around him. Because James Buchanan's tragedy wasn't loud. It was a lifetime of being left behind. He was born in 1791 in Cove Gap, Pennsylvania, the second of 11 children. His father was a successful merchant, the family comfortable. James went to Dickinson College, then studied law. By his early 20s, he had begun building a reputation as one of Pennsylvania's sharpest legal minds. He was tall, handsome, impeccably dressed, a rising star. And then, in 1819, he fell in love. Her name was Anne Coleman. She was 23, the daughter of a wealthy iron magnate. Their courtship was brief, formal, filled with letters. But something went wrong. Rumors swirled of coldness, neglect, another woman. Buchanan, absorbed in work, failed to visit her when she fell ill. Anne died suddenly. Some said suicide. Others, nervous exhaustion. No autopsy, no answers. She was buried quickly. Her parents refused Buchanan entry to the funeral, refused him closure, refused to even let him see her body. He wrote them a letter pleading, apologizing, grieving. "I feel happiness has fled from me forever," he wrote. "I have lost the only earthly object of my affections." He never loved again, never married. And from that moment forward, James Buchanan became a man shaped by absence. He filled the void with work. Politics became his religion. He served in the Pennsylvania House, then in Congress, then the Senate. He was appointed Minister to Russia, Secretary of State, and Minister to Great Britain. Each post carried him further from home and deeper into the solitary rhythms of a life without companionship. He never kept a family of his own. Instead, his niece, Harriet Lane, became his de facto daughter. He raised her, doted on her, brought her to every official function. She became the first lady of his presidency. She was Grace, incarnate elegant, intelligent, beloved by Washington society. She was his lifeline. And yet, even that relationship bore the mark of shadowed affection. He adored her, but never quite reached her. His letters to her were filled with formality, rarely warmth. He called her "my dear niece," not "my girl." He sent her gifts, arranged her travels, but never bared his grief to her. Buchanan's personal loneliness deepened during his presidency. He entered office at age 65, unmarried, childless, and already physically declining. His eyesight was fading. He suffered from arthritis. His digestion was poor. He rarely slept more than a few hours. The White House was eerily quiet during his term. No children's laughter, no spouse's footsteps. Just Buchanan and his staff, moving like ghosts through rooms once filled with chaos and joy. Even his hobbies were solitary. He walked alone in the garden, read alone in the library, dined at a small table, often in silence, save for the clinking of utensils. Occasionally, he hosted dinners, but never lingered. Never drank heavily, always retired early. He wrote letters, thousands of them, to Harriet, to friends, to foreign ministers and aging senators. Letters full of formality, deference, self-justification. After he left office in 1861, the nation tore itself apart. The Civil War began within weeks of his departure, and Buchanan retreated fully into Wheatland. He became a recluse. He defended himself in letters, in essays, in long, rambling justifications written by candlelight and sent to newspapers that rarely published them. He wrote an entire book, a memoir, detailing the decisions of his presidency. It was 296 pages of explanation. He mailed copies to friends with inscriptions pleading for understanding. But the world didn't listen. Buchanan had been replaced. Lincoln was a giant. Buchanan was a shadow, and he knew it. In his final years, his health collapsed. He suffered from gout, respiratory infections, swelling in his legs. He walked with a cane, coughed blood. Doctors visited weekly. He refused most treatment. His appetite vanished. The man who once dined with princes and queens now took meals alone in his upstairs room, a blanket over his lap, staring out the window at the Pennsylvania fields. Harriet visited often. So did a few nephews. But the house remained quiet. The clocks kept ticking, and Buchanan kept writing. In May 1868, he caught a cold. It turned into bronchitis. His lungs filled with fluid. His heart began to fail. On June 1868, James Buchanan died. He was 77. The newspapers printed brief obituaries. Few mourned publicly. He was buried near his parents in Lancaster, under a modest stone with an inscription he had written himself, "I have done my duty as God gave me the light to see that duty." A final justification. A final defense. But it wasn't enough to quiet the silence he left behind. James Buchanan's tragedy is not in scandal or collapse. It's in the slow, aching drip of a life never truly lived beyond responsibility. A man who lost love in his 20s and spent the next 50 years trying to fill that void with public service. A man who returned home to die in a house too big, too quiet, too empty. He outlived friends, outlived relevance, outlived affection. Millard Fillmore. The house on Niagara Square stood silent beneath the weight of snow. Buffalo, New York, was still just a fledgling city in 1853, its streets more mud than marble, its skyline still climbing, but inside the Italianate structure at number 180 Franklin Street, the man who had once held the highest office in the land sat quietly by the fire, watching the flame flicker low. Millard Fillmore, 13th President of the United States, had returned home. But he had not returned whole. No brass bands welcomed him. No crowds lined the streets. There was no hero's homecoming. Because Fillmore's story, like the weather of his adopted city, had always been cold. And his tragedy wasn't one of blood or battle but of loss compounded by silence, of love ripped away at the very moment he needed it most. Millard Fillmore was born in 1800 in a log cabin in the Finger Lakes region of New York, the second of 9 children. Poverty wasn't just a feature of his childhood, it was the dominant fact of it. His father was a tenant farmer. The family moved frequently, always chasing land, always coming up short. Fillmore's clothes were patched, his education intermittent. By age 15, he was indentured to a clothmaker. The work was grueling bleaching, dyeing, carding wool by hand. But Fillmore had something burning inside him. He borrowed books, walked miles just to access a library, studied at night by firelight, taught himself law. By 23, he passed the bar. He married Abigail Powers, his former teacher. She was refined, thoughtful, and introverted. Their bond was immediate and deep. She grounded him, believed in him when few did. Together, they had 2 children, Millard Jr. and Mary. He rose through politics steadily, assemblyman, comptroller, congressman, and then, unexpectedly, vice president. When President Zachary Taylor died suddenly in July 1850, Fillmore found himself thrust into the Oval Office. He was not prepared, but he did not flinch. Abigail moved into the White House reluctantly. She disliked the spotlight, refused to host social functions, disapproved of extravagance, yet she supported him. Behind closed doors, they read books together, discussed policy. Her counsel was quiet, but constant. But Washington is not kind to private people, and the cold took her. In March 1853, barely a month after they left the White House, Abigail Fillmore caught pneumonia while attending Franklin Pierce's inauguration. The ceremony had been held outdoors, in freezing temperatures. She stood beside her husband, shivering beneath layers of black lace. By the end of the week, she was coughing blood. 2 weeks later, she was dead. The doctors called it inflammation of the lungs. Millard Fillmore called it the end of his world. She died in the same Washington boarding house where they had stayed during his first days in Congress. Full circle, cold to cold. He returned to Buffalo with her body. The funeral was modest, the grave marked with a simple stone. He sat beside it for hours. He would return there, again and again, through the years. But her absence wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of the long unspooling. He wrote to friends of insomnia, of pacing his halls at night, of reading the same lines in books over and over without comprehension. He spoke rarely, smiled even less. Mary, his daughter, kept house for him. His son, Millard Jr., drifted. Fillmore tried to immerse himself in civic life. He founded the university at Buffalo, built hospitals, libraries, schools, but none of it filled the space. Then, in 1858, his daughter Mary died suddenly of cholera. She was just 22, bright, literate, full of promise. She had been his last emotional tether. After her death, he stopped writing letters altogether for a time. The house grew darker, quieter. Millard Jr. left for Europe. Fillmore, now truly alone, wandered his own house like a ghost. He remarried in 1858 Caroline McIntosh, a wealthy widow from Albany. But the marriage was, by most accounts, cold, companionate, not romantic. Caroline had money, not warmth. They lived in the same house, but rarely shared a room. Guests remarked on the silence at dinners. Even his new wife kept her distance. Fillmore's health began to falter in the 1860s. He developed angina, breathing difficulties, arthritis in his knees and hands, which made writing painful. He could no longer walk the cemetery paths as he once had. Instead, he sat, watching Buffalo grow through his window, watching the snow fall in long, unbroken sheets. He wrote short, brittle notes to friends. "Time dulls all," he said in one, but he didn't believe it. On the 27th of February, 1874, he suffered a stroke. It paralyzed the left side of his body. He lost the ability to speak clearly. Still, he held on. Another month, then another. But the decline was steady, merciless. On March 8, 1874, Millard Fillmore died. The last words attributed to him were, "The nourishment is palatable," a comment about soup fed to him by his nurse. He was 74 years old. No national mourning followed. His funeral in Buffalo was dignified, but quiet. A procession. Some eulogies. Then the cold ground. He was buried beside Abigail and Mary at Forest Lawn Cemetery. No monument, just stone and silence. His life, once entangled with history, had become footnote and echo. And yet his tragedy lingers not because of scandal or violence or disgrace, but because of how persistently he was left behind. By love, by family, by time. The man who had climbed from log cabin poverty to the White House died surrounded not by the crowds of ambition, but by empty rooms and fading portraits. A life of structure, a heart cracked in silence.